Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? The town of Millbrook had always been the sort of place where nothing much happened, and that was exactly how its residents preferred it. Nestled between rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees, the town stretched along a lazy river that wound its way through the countryside like a silver ribbon, catching the afternoon light. Houses sat comfortably apart from one another, each surrounded by well-tended gardens where roses climbed white picket. Fences and vegetable patches produced tomatoes and beans that neighbors shared over back fences. On a Tuesday morning in early September, when the air held just the first hint of autumn's approach, Officer Margaret Chen made her usual patrol down Main Street. The street was lined with old-fashioned storefronts that had remained largely unchanged for decades. Thompson's Hardware still displayed the same faded red paint on its wooden sign, and the windows of Mabel's Diner reflected the morning sun in patterns that danced across the sidewalk. Margaret had been walking this same route for nearly 8 years now, and she knew every crack in the pavement, every door that squeaked, and every face that would appear behind the windows as she passed. The morning routine was always the same. She would start at the eastern edge of town where the old stone bridge crossed the river, then walk slowly westward, checking on the businesses as they opened for the day. Mrs. Patterson would be sweeping the front steps of her flower shop, releasing the sweet scent of roses and lavender into the cool morning air. Mr. Hendricks would be arranging newspapers outside his small market, methodically straightening each stack until they formed perfect lines. The rhythm of these small actions created a peaceful symphony that marked the beginning of each day in Millbrook. But this Tuesday morning brought with it a subtle disturbance to the usual pattern. As Margaret approached the White House on Elm Street, where Sarah Mitchell lived alone, she noticed that the porch light was still burning bright against the pale morning sky. Sarah was known throughout the town for her punctual habits. Every morning at exactly 6:30, she would turn off her porch light, water the hanging baskets of petunias that adorned her front steps, and then drive her small blue sedan to the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. Margaret paused on the sidewalk, studying the house more carefully. The curtains in the front window remained closed, which was unusual for Sarah, who always opened them first thing to let the morning light stream into her living room. The driveway was empty, but that could mean Sarah had already left for school. Yet something about the stillness of the house felt different from the comfortable quiet that usually surrounded it. The officer walked slowly up the stone pathway that led to Sarah's front door. The petunias in their hanging baskets looked slightly drooped, as if they had been waiting for their morning drink of water. Margaret knocked gently on the wooden door, the sound echoing softly in the morning air. She waited, listening for the sound of footsteps or Sarah's cheerful voice calling out that she would be right there. Instead, the house remained silent, wrapped in a stillness that seemed to press against the windows and seep through the walls. Margaret knocked again, a bit more firmly this time. The sound seemed louder in the quiet morning, and she found herself glancing around to see if any neighbors had noticed her presence. Mrs. Garrett, who lived in the house next door, was known for keeping a careful eye on the neighborhood. Her kitchen window faced Sarah's driveway, and Margaret often saw her figure moving behind the sheer curtains as she went about her morning routine of making coffee and preparing breakfast. After waiting several more minutes, Margaret decided to walk around to the back of the house. The backyard was enclosed by a wooden fence that Sarah had painted white just last summer. The gate was latched but not locked, and it opened with a soft creak that seemed to disturb the peaceful morning air. Sarah's garden stretched out behind. The house, filled with neat rows of vegetables and flowers that showed the careful attention she gave to every detail of her life. The back door was a heavy wooden affair with 4 small glass panels that allowed a view into Sarah's kitchen. Margaret cupped her hands against the glass and peered inside. The kitchen appeared exactly as it should, with clean counters and dishes neatly arranged in the drying rack beside the sink. A coffee mug sat on the counter, and beside it was a plate with what appeared to be the remains of toast crumbs. Everything looked perfectly normal, as if Sarah had simply stepped out for a moment and would return at any time. Margaret tried the door handle more out of thorough procedure than any real expectation that it would open. To her surprise, the door turned easily under her hand. Sarah had apparently left it unlocked, which was somewhat unusual for her, but not entirely unheard of in a town like Millbrook, where people often felt safe, leaving doors unlocked during the day. Stepping into the kitchen, Margaret called out Sarah's name in a voice that was loud enough to be heard throughout the house, but gentle enough not to startle anyone who might be resting. The sound of her own voice seemed to echo strangely in the empty space, and she found herself listening intently to the silence that followed. The house had that particular quality of stillness that comes when no one has been moving through its rooms for some time. The kitchen opened into a dining room where a small table sat beneath a window that looked out over the front yard. Sarah's purse sat on one of the chairs, and her car keys lay beside it in a way that suggested they had been placed there intentionally rather than dropped in haste. Margaret examined the purse carefully without touching it, noting that it appeared to contain all the usual items one would expect to find there. Moving through the house room by room, Margaret found everything in perfect order. Sarah's bedroom showed no signs of disturbance, with the bed neatly made and clothes hanging properly in the closet. The bathroom contained all the expected toiletries, arranged with the same careful attention to detail that Sarah brought to every aspect of her life. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything had been taken, and no evidence that Sarah had packed for a trip. By the time Margaret completed her careful examination of the house, it was nearly 9 o'clock. She locked the back door and made her way to the elementary school, hoping to find that Sarah had simply arrived early and was already in her classroom preparing for the day's lessons. The school building was a cheerful brick structure that had been expanded several times over the decades, with newer wings extending from the original building like arms reaching out to embrace the playground and parking lot. Principal Roberts greeted Margaret with the kind of warm smile that had made him beloved by students and parents alike during his 15 years at the school. However, his expression grew concerned when Margaret explained the reason for her visit. Sarah had not arrived at school that morning, and she had not called to report that she would be absent. This was completely unlike her, as Sarah prided herself on perfect attendance and had never missed a day without proper notification. The principal accompanied Margaret to Sarah's classroom, which remained locked and dark. Through the window in the door, they could see student desks arranged in neat rows, with worksheets and books prepared for the day's lessons, exactly as Sarah would have left them the previous afternoon. The bulletin boards displayed colorful autumn leaves that the children had cut from construction paper, and alphabet charts hung along the walls in the precise manner that reflected Sarah's organized approach to teaching. Margaret spent the rest of the morning speaking with other teachers and staff members who knew Sarah well. They all described her in remarkably similar terms: punctual, reliable, dedicated to her students, and deeply rooted in the routines that structured her daily life. She had taught at the school for 12 years and had never given anyone reason to worry about her well-being or question her commitment to her responsibilities. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Margaret began the process of reaching out to Sarah's family members and close friends. Sarah's sister lived in a city about 200 miles away, and when Margaret called her, she learned that Sarah had not mentioned any plans to travel or any concerns that might have prompted her to leave town unexpectedly. The sister's voice carried a note of worry that seemed to deepen as she answered Margaret's questions about Sarah's recent state of mind and any changes in her usual patterns. Sarah's closest friend in Millbrook was Elena Rodriguez, who worked as a librarian at the town's small but well-maintained library. Elena and Sarah had developed a friendship over their shared love of books and quiet activities, often spending Saturday afternoons together, browsing through the library's collection or walking along the river path that wound through the park at the center of town. When Margaret found Elena at the library, she was in the process of checking in a stack of returned books, running each one through the scanning system with the same methodical care that characterized most activities in Millbrook. Elena's face showed immediate concern when Margaret explained the situation, and she set down the book she had been processing to give her full attention to the conversation. Elena confirmed that she had spoken with Sarah by telephone the previous Sunday evening, and that Sarah had seemed perfectly normal during their conversation. They had discussed plans to attend the autumn festival that the town held every October in the park, and Sarah had mentioned her excitement about a new reading program she was planning to introduce to her students. There had been nothing in her voice or her words to suggest that she was troubled by anything or considering any sort of change to her routine. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself walking through the town's quiet streets, speaking with neighbors and shopkeepers who might have seen Sarah recently or noticed anything unusual about her behavior. The conversations all followed a similar pattern, with people expressing surprise and concern while confirming that Sarah had seemed exactly like herself in all their recent interactions. Mrs. Garrett, the neighbor who lived next door to Sarah, proved to be a particularly valuable source of information due to her habit of observing the daily rhythms of the neighborhood from her kitchen window. She reported that she had seen Sarah arrive home from school the previous Monday afternoon at her usual time of 4:15. Sarah had parked her car in the driveway, collected her bag of school materials from the back seat, and walked to her front door with the same purposeful stride that marked all her movements. Mrs. Garrett had not seen Sarah leave the house that evening, but she acknowledged that she did not maintain a constant watch over the neighborhood and could easily have missed Sarah's departure if she had gone out after dark. This was not uncommon, as Sarah occasionally attended evening meetings at the school or visited the library during their extended hours on Monday and Wednesday evenings. The hardware store owner, Jim Thompson, remembered that Sarah had stopped by his shop the previous Saturday morning to purchase a small packet of flower seeds. She had mentioned her intention to plant them in the window boxes that adorned the front of her house, and she had seemed pleased about the prospect of having fresh flowers to brighten the approach of winter. Jim described her demeanor as cheerful and engaged, showing no signs of distress or preoccupation. As evening approached, and the first shadows began to lengthen across the town streets, Margaret found herself standing once again in front of Sarah's white house on Elm Street. The porch light had been turned off at some point during the day, though Margaret could not remember exactly when that had happened. The house appeared peaceful and ordinary, giving no indication of the mystery that had begun to unfold around its absent occupant. Margaret walked slowly around the perimeter of the property, looking for any detail that might have escaped her notice during the morning's investigation. The flower beds showed signs of recent watering, and the lawn had been mowed within the past week. Sarah's small blue sedan was indeed missing from the driveway, which suggested that whatever had happened, it had involved Sarah leaving the house of her own accord. That evening, as Margaret completed her written report of the day's investigation, she found herself struggling to capture in words the subtle sense of wrongness that had begun to settle over the situation. All the evidence suggested that Sarah had simply decided to go somewhere, taking her car and leaving her house secured behind her. Yet everything about Sarah's character and habits argued against such spontaneous behavior, especially behavior that would result in her missing work without explanation. Report would become the first entry in what would eventually grow into a substantial file, documenting the disappearance of Sarah Mitchell from the quiet town of Millbrook. Over the following days and weeks, more details would be added, more interviews conducted, and more questions raised than answered. But for now, on this first evening of what would become a long and puzzling investigation, Margaret could only document the facts as she had observed them and note the troubling absence of any clear explanation for Sarah's disappearance. The town of Millbrook settled into its evening routine with the same peaceful rhythm that had characterized its days for decades. Lights came on in windows, families gathered around dinner tables, and the soft sounds of domestic life drifted through the streets. Yet beneath this familiar tranquility, a new element had been introduced: the quiet mystery of Sarah Mitchell's unexplained absence from the life she had built so carefully and maintained so faithfully. As the days passed, the investigation would expand to include state police resources and investigative techniques that went far beyond what the small town's limited police force could manage on its own. But the essential mystery would remain unchanged. A reliable, predictable woman had simply vanished from her orderly life, leaving behind no clear indication of where she had gone or why she had chosen to leave. The weather during those first weeks of the investigation remained mild and pleasant, with warm afternoons giving way to cool evenings that carried the scent of wood smoke from fireplaces and the earthy smell of leaves, beginning their transformation into autumn colors. The river continued its lazy journey through the town, reflecting the changing sky and carrying with it the same peaceful rhythm that had characterized Millbrook for generations. Sarah's third-grade classroom remained empty, with a substitute teacher taking over the daily lessons and trying to maintain the sense of structure and security that Sarah's students had come to expect. The children asked questions about their regular teacher's absence, and school staff did their best to provide reassuring answers while privately sharing the growing concern that had begun to spread throughout the adult community. The autumn festival that Sarah and Elena had discussed during their last telephone conversation took place as scheduled in the town park. Local families gathered to enjoy apple cider and homemade baked goods, while children played games and collected colorful leaves to take home as decorations. The festival had always been one of Sarah's favorite events of the year, and her absence was felt as a quiet but persistent note of sadness beneath the community's efforts to maintain their traditional celebrations. Elena Rodriguez found herself thinking often about her missing friend as she went about her daily work at the library. She would catch herself listening for the sound of Sarah's voice among the patrons who visited each day, and she frequently paused in her cataloging work to gaze out the window toward the street where she might see Sarah's familiar figure walking toward the library entrance. The routine activities that had once brought comfort and satisfaction now seemed to emphasize the absence of someone who had been an important part of the daily fabric of life in Millbrook. Margaret Chun continued her patrols through the town's quiet streets, but now her attention was focused with particular intensity on any detail that might provide a clue to Sarah's whereabouts. She found herself studying the faces of visitors to the town, wondering if any of them might have some connection to the missing teacher. She paid closer attention to vehicles parked along the streets, looking for anything that seemed out of place or unfamiliar. The investigation had expanded to include searches of the wooded areas that surrounded Millbrook, with teams of volunteers walking carefully through the forests and along the riverbank. They looked for any sign that Sarah might have wandered away from town and become lost or injured, though this scenario seemed unlikely given her practical nature and familiarity with the local area. The searches were conducted with thorough care, but they revealed nothing more significant than the occasional piece of litter left behind by hikers or fishermen. State police investigators brought additional resources to the case, including techniques for analyzing Sarah's financial records and communication history. They discovered that her bank accounts showed no unusual activity in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, and her credit cards had not been used since the previous Saturday when she had made her ordinary purchases at the local grocery store. Her telephone records revealed only routine calls to family members and friends, with nothing to suggest that she had been planning any sort of departure from her established routine. Asterisk. The investigation of Sarah's computer revealed email correspondence that was entirely consistent with her role as a teacher and her quiet social life in Millbrook. She had exchanged messages with other teachers about curriculum planning and student activities. She had corresponded with her sister about family matters and holiday plans. She had participated in online discussions related to her hobbies of gardening and reading. Nothing in her digital communications suggested any source of stress or concern that might have prompted her to leave town unexpectedly. As autumn deepened into winter, the mystery of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance became woven into the daily life of Millbrook in a way that was both persistent and subtle. People continued to hope for news of her safe return, while gradually adjusting to the reality that their community had been touched by something unexplained and troubling. The White House on Elm Street stood empty, with Elena Rodriguez checking on it periodically to ensure that everything remained secure and undisturbed. The seasonal changes brought their own rhythm to the investigation, with snow eventually covering the ground and making certain types of searching impossible until spring returned. The river partially froze during the coldest weeks, creating a different landscape that investigators examined carefully for any signs that might have been hidden during the warmer months. But winter passed without bringing any significant developments in the Val case. Spring's arrival brought renewed hope and activity to the investigation. The snow melted to reveal the same landscape that had been searched so thoroughly during the previous autumn. But investigators looked again with fresh eyes and new possibilities in mind. The river ran high with snowmelt, and teams walked along its banks looking for anything that the winter weather might have revealed or displaced. Sarah's garden, left untended through the winter months, began to show signs of the natural renewal that came with the changing season. The flower seeds she had purchased from Thompson's hardware store the previous autumn had apparently been planted, as small green shoots began to emerge from the window boxes that adorned her house. The sight of these new plants growing in the absence of the person who had planted them added a poignant note to the ongoing mystery of her disappearance. The case file grew thicker with each passing month, filled with interview transcripts, search reports, and follow-up investigations of potential leads that ultimately proved fruitless. Each piece of documentation added to the detailed picture of Sarah's life and character, but none provided the key to understanding what had happened to her on that quiet Tuesday morning when she had simply vanished from the orderly existence she had built in Millbrook. 1 year after Sarah's disappearance, the town held a memorial service in the park where the autumn festival had taken place. Friends, colleagues, and community members gathered to remember Sarah and to express their hope that she would someday return to them safely. Elena Rodriguez spoke about her friend's dedication to her students and her deep connection to the community that had been her home for so many years. Principal Roberts described Sarah's contributions to the school and the lasting impact she had made on the children she had taught. The memorial service was conducted with the same quiet dignity that characterized most activities in Millbrook, but beneath the peaceful ceremony lay the persistent questions that continued to trouble everyone who had known Sarah Mitchell. Where had she gone on that September morning? What had prompted her to leave behind the life she had seemed to value so deeply? Would they ever know the truth about what had happened to their friend, neighbor, and colleague? As the investigation moved into its second year, it took on the characteristics of a cold case, with periodic reviews and follow-ups but no active daily pursuit of new leads. Margaret Chen continued her patrols through the town streets, always alert for any information that might relate to Sarah's case. Elena Rodriguez maintained her quiet vigil over Sarah's house and garden, keeping alive the hope that her friend would someday return to reclaim the life she had left behind. The mystery of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had become part of Millbrook's history, a puzzle that would be discussed and wondered about for years to come. It served as a reminder that even in the most peaceful and predictable communities, unexplained events could occur that challenged assumptions about safety, security, and the reliability of familiar routines. The White House on Elm Street stood as a testament to a life interrupted, its rooms holding the accumulated possessions and memories of someone who had simply stepped out one morning and never returned. The investigation would continue to follow any new leads that might develop, but for now, The case remained an open question mark in the otherwise orderly life of a quiet town, where nothing much was supposed to happen. In the weeks following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, as investigators worked to piece together any clues that might explain her vanishing, they began to construct a detailed portrait of her life through the careful examination of her daily routines, her relationships, and the spaces where she had spent her time. What emerged was the picture of a woman whose existence had been marked by consistency, kindness, and a deep appreciation for the simple pleasures that small-town life could offer. Sarah had arrived in Millbrook 12 years earlier, in late August, driving a small moving truck loaded with the possessions she had accumulated during her previous life in a larger city 2 states away. She had accepted the teaching position at Millbrook Elementary after a telephone interview with Principal Roberts, who had been impressed by her enthusiasm for working with young children and her evident dedication to creating positive learning experiences. The decision to move to Millbrook had been made, she later told friends, as much for the town's peaceful atmosphere as for the professional opportunity it represented. Her first apartment had been a small but comfortable space above Henderson's Bakery on Main Street, where she could wake each morning to the scent of fresh bread and pastries being prepared in the kitchen below. The apartment's windows looked out over the street, providing Sarah with a view of the town's daily rhythms as people went about their morning routines. She had decorated the space with care, choosing warm colors and comfortable furniture that reflected her appreciation for creating environments that felt welcoming and secure. During those early months in Millbrook, Sarah had established the patterns of behavior that would characterize her entire time in the community. She rose each morning at 6 o'clock, allowing herself enough time to prepare for the day without hurrying. She would make coffee and toast, often standing by her kitchen window to watch the town awakening below. By 7:15, she would leave for the school, walking the 6 blocks when weather permitted and driving her small car when rain or snow made walking impractical. Her teaching style had quickly earned the respect and affection of both students and parents. Sarah believed in creating classroom environments where children felt safe to ask questions and make mistakes as part of the learning process. She decorated her classroom with student artwork and seasonal displays, changing them regularly to maintain an atmosphere of freshness and engagement. Her lesson plans were meticulous, reflecting hours of preparation that went far beyond the minimum requirements of her position. After school each day, Sarah often remained in her classroom for an additional hour, preparing materials for the following day's lessons and grading student work with careful attention to each child's individual progress. She wrote detailed comments on assignments, offering encouragement and specific suggestions for improvement. Parents frequently remarked on the personalized attention their children received in Sarah's classroom and the evident care she took in fostering each student's academic and social development. The transition from apartment living to home ownership had occurred during Sarah's 4th year in Millbrook, when the White House on Elm Street became available for purchase. The house had previously belonged to an elderly couple who had maintained it with great care before moving to a retirement community in a neighboring state. Sarah had fallen in love with the property's character and charm, particularly the large front porch with its white columns and the spacious backyard that offered possibilities for gardening. The process of making the house her own had been undertaken with the same methodical approach that Sarah brought to all aspects of her life. She had spent weekends painting walls, refinishing wooden floors, and selecting furniture that complemented the home's traditional architecture. The kitchen had been updated with modern appliances while preserving the original cabinets and countertops that gave the room its distinctive character. Sarah's backyard garden had become one of her greatest sources of pleasure and pride. She had spent considerable time planning the layout, researching which plants would thrive in the local climate and soil conditions, and learning about companion planting techniques that would maximize both beauty and productivity. The vegetable section of the garden provided fresh produce that she shared generously with neighbors, while the flower beds offered continuous blooms from spring through fall. The routine of garden maintenance had become deeply integrated into Sarah's daily schedule. Each morning before school, she would spend a few minutes checking on her plants, watering as needed and making mental notes about tasks that required attention. Evenings often found her working among the flowers and vegetables, finding in the physical activity and connection with nature a peaceful way to transition from the structured environment of the classroom to the quieter rhythms of home life. Sarah's social connections in Millbrook had developed gradually, built on shared interests and the natural interactions that occurred in a small community where paths crossed regularly. Her friendship with Alana Rodriguez had begun during Sarah's second year in town, when she had become a regular patron of the library and had engaged Alana in conversations about books they both enjoyed. Their shared appreciation for literature had evolved into a deeper friendship based on compatible temperaments and similar values. The two women had established a pleasant routine of Saturday afternoon activities that might include browsing in the library, walking along the river path, or visiting the farmers market that operated in the park during the growing season. They often prepared meals together, taking turns hosting dinner in their respective homes and experimenting with recipes they discovered in the cookbooks they borrowed from the library's collection. Sarah's relationship with her neighbors had been characterized by the kind of friendly but respectful distance that allowed people to feel connected without being intrusive. She had made a point of introducing herself to nearby residents when she first moved to Elm Street, and she had maintained cordial interactions with them over the years. Mrs. Garrett, who lived next door, had become particularly fond of Sarah and often commented on what a pleasant and considerate neighbor she was. The seasonal rhythms of Millbrook had provided structure and meaning to Sarah's life in ways that went beyond the academic calendar that governed her teaching schedule. She looked forward to the town's annual events with genuine enthusiasm, participating in the spring cleanup day when residents worked together to prepare public spaces for the growing season, volunteering at the summer concert series held in the park, and contributing homemade items to the bake sale that accompanied the autumn festival. Winter months brought their own pleasures, with Sarah often spending evenings reading by her fireplace while snow fell outside her windows. She had developed the habit of keeping a journal during these quieter months, recording her thoughts about her students' progress, her plans for the garden, and her observations about the changing seasons. These journals, discovered by investigators after her disappearance, revealed a person who found deep satisfaction in the routines of her chosen life and who approached each day with optimism and purpose. Sarah's extended family relationships had remained strong despite the physical distance that separated her from her relatives. She maintained regular telephone contact with her sister and exchanged frequent letters and emails with cousins, aunts and uncles who lived in various parts of the country. Family gatherings during holidays were important to her, and she would drive hundreds of miles when necessary to attend weddings, birthday celebrations, and other significant events. Her sister had visited Millbrook several times over the years, staying in the guest room that Sarah had furnished with particular care. These visits had been marked by long conversations, walks around the town, and quiet domestic activities that strengthened the bond between the two women. Sarah had spoken often about her contentment with her life in Millbrook, expressing gratitude for having found a community where she felt valued and connected. Professional aspects of Sarah's life had continued to evolve throughout her years in Millbrook, with her taking on additional responsibilities and pursuing opportunities for professional development. She had served on curriculum committees, mentored new teachers, and participated in workshops and conferences that enhanced her teaching skills. Her classroom had often been used as a model for visiting educators, and she had been asked to present at regional conferences about her innovative approaches to elementary education. Sarah's commitment to her students extended well beyond the formal requirements of her teaching position. She had initiated an after-school reading program that provided additional support for children who struggled with literacy skills, and she had organized field trips that exposed her students to cultural and educational opportunities in the surrounding region. Her classroom library had grown over the years through her personal purchases of books that she believed would engage and inspire young readers. Financial aspects of Sarah's life had been managed with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all her activities. She had maintained a modest but comfortable standard of living, saving regularly and making conservative investments that would provide security for her future. Her bank records showed consistent deposits of her teaching salary and occasional small expenditures for classroom supplies that she purchased with her own funds. Sarah's car, the small blue sedan that had disappeared along with her, had been purchased 3 years earlier after her previous vehicle had become too expensive to maintain. She had chosen the car for its reliability and fuel efficiency rather than for any aesthetic considerations, viewing it primarily as a practical tool for transportation rather than as a reflection of her personality or status. The contents of Sarah's house, examined carefully by investigators, revealed the possessions of someone who valued quality over quantity and who chose items for their functionality and personal meaning rather than for their monetary value. Her books were well read, with margins containing her handwritten notes and observations. Her kitchen contained practical cookware and dishes that showed regular use, along with a collection of cookbooks that reflected her interest in preparing healthy, flavorful meals. Sarah's bedroom had been decorated with items that held personal significance: photographs of family members and friends, artwork created by former students, and small decorative objects collected during travels to visit relatives in different parts of the country. Her dresser drawers contained clothing that was practical and well maintained, with nothing to suggest that she had packed for any sort of trip or planned departure. The basement of Sarah's house had been converted into a combination workspace and storage area where she kept teaching supplies, gardening tools, and seasonal decorations. The space was organized with characteristic attention to detail, with items sorted and labeled to facilitate easy location when needed. Investigators found nothing among these possessions that suggested any preparation for departure or any indication of distress or dissatisfaction with her current circumstances. Sarah's daily routines during the weeks immediately preceding her disappearance had shown no deviation from the patterns that had characterized her life in Millbrook. Colleagues at the school reported that she had seemed entirely normal in her interactions with students and staff. She had participated in planning meetings for upcoming school events and had expressed enthusiasm about a new science curriculum that the school was considering implementing. Her lesson plan book, found on her classroom desk, contained detailed preparations for several weeks into the future, including notes about special activities she had planned to coincide with various holidays and seasonal changes. The care and thought that had gone into these preparations argued against any possibility that she had been planning to abandon her teaching responsibilities. Elena Rodriguez, in her conversations with investigators, had emphasized how settled in content Sarah had seemed in their recent interactions. They had discussed plans for Elena's upcoming birthday celebration and had talked about books they wanted to read together during the winter months. Sarah had mentioned her excitement about trying some new varieties of flowers in her garden the following spring and had asked Elena to help her research plants that would attract butterflies and beneficial insects. The mystery of Sarah's disappearance became even more puzzling when viewed against the background of a life that had been built so carefully and maintained so faithfully. Every aspect of her existence in Millbrook suggested deep roots and long-term commitment to the community and the relationship she had developed there. Her disappearance represented not just the absence of a person, but the interruption of a life that had been characterized by consistency, responsibility, and genuine engagement with the people and activities that surrounded her. As investigators continued their work, They found themselves confronting the fundamental question of how someone so thoroughly integrated into a community could simply vanish without leaving any trace of their intentions or destination. The evidence of Sarah's life pointed overwhelmingly toward a person who had found satisfaction and meaning in her chosen circumstances and who had every reason to continue the routines that had brought her such evident fulfillment. The contrast between the stability of Sarah's established life and the complete mystery of her disappearance would continue to puzzle investigators and community members for months and years to come. Her empty house stood as a monument to a life interrupted, with all the possessions and preparations for future activities that she had left behind serving as silent testimony to the unexplained nature of her absence from the community that had become her home. Asterisk. 3 months after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had shaken the quiet community of Millbrook, another puzzling incident began to unfold in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. Situated just 15 miles downstream along the same gentle river that wound through both communities, Cedar Falls shared many characteristics with Millbrook: tree-lined streets, well-maintained older homes, and residents who valued the peaceful rhythm of small-town life. However, the mystery that developed there would prove to be quite different in nature, involving not the disappearance of a person, but the gradual vanishing of personal belongings that seemed to evaporate from their familiar places without explanation. The first report came on a gray November morning when Mrs. Dorothy Whitman called the Cedar Falls police to report that her late husband's watch had gone missing from her bedroom dresser. Mrs. Whitman was 83 years old and had lived in the same colonial-style house on Maple Avenue for over 50 years. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her sharp mind and excellent memory, qualities that had served her well during her 40-year career as the town's head librarian before her retirement. Officer David Park responded to Mrs. Whitman's call with the patient attention that such matters required when dealing with elderly residents. He understood that items that seemed missing to older community members sometimes turned out to have been misplaced or moved to unfamiliar locations during routine household activities. However, as he listened to Mrs. Whitman's careful account of the missing watch, he found himself taking her concerns more seriously than he might have initially expected. The watch in question had been a retirement gift to Mrs. Whitman's husband, Charles, when he had concluded his career as a mathematics teacher at the local high school. It was a gold Hamilton timepiece with a leather band, and Charles had worn it every day for the 20 years between his retirement and his death 3 years earlier. Since his passing, Mrs. Whitman had kept the watch in the same location on her dresser, where Charles had placed it each night before going to bed. Mrs. Whitman led Officer Park to her bedroom, which was located on the second floor of the house and accessed by a staircase that she climbed carefully but without assistance. The bedroom was furnished with pieces that had been acquired over decades of marriage, including a large mahogany dresser that stood against the wall opposite the bed. On top of the dresser, arranged with precise care, were various personal items: a jewelry box, several framed photographs, a small lamp, and a crystal dish that contained loose change and buttons. The spot where the watch had always rested was clearly visible, marked by a slight discoloration in the dresser's finish that showed where the watch case had sat for years. Mrs. Whitman explained that she dusted the dresser every Tuesday morning as part of her weekly housekeeping routine, and she was absolutely certain that the watch had been in its usual place when she had cleaned the previous week. Officer Park examined the bedroom carefully, looking for any signs of forced entry or disturbance. The windows were secured with their original brass locks, and there were no scratches or other marks to suggest that anyone had attempted to open them from the outside. The room appeared exactly as one would expect to find it in the home of someone who maintained careful order in all aspects of her daily life. Nothing else seemed to be missing or out of place. Mrs. Whitman had lived alone in the house since her husband's death, and she maintained an independent lifestyle that included driving her own car, managing her own finances and keeping up with a modest but active social schedule. She had a cleaning lady who came every other Friday to help with more strenuous household tasks. But this woman had been working for Mrs. Whitman for over 10 years and was considered completely trustworthy by everyone who knew her. House had no signs of forced entry at any of the doors or windows on the first floor. Mrs. Whitman kept her doors locked at all times, a habit she had developed not out of fear but simply as a matter of practical caution. She had given spare keys only to her adult daughter who lived in a city 2 hours away, and to her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who checked on the house when Mrs. Whitman traveled to visit family members. Officer Park spent considerable time discussing with Mrs. Whitman any recent visitors to her home or any changes in her routine that might be relevant to the missing watch. She had hosted her weekly bridge club the previous Thursday evening, a gathering that had included the same 4 women who had been meeting in her living room for over 15 years. These were all longtime residents of Cedar Falls whom Mrs. Whitman had known for decades, and the suggestion that any of them might have taken the watch seemed completely implausible. The only other recent visitor had been a young man who had come to the door the previous week offering to clean gutters and perform minor exterior maintenance work. Mrs. Whitman had politely declined his services and had not invited him into the house. She remembered the encounter clearly because she had been impressed by the young man's politeness and had felt somewhat sorry for turning him away. But she had a regular handyman who took care of such needs and did not require additional help. As Officer Park completed his initial report on the missing watch, he found himself somewhat puzzled by the incident, but not particularly alarmed. Elderly residents occasionally experienced confusion about the location of personal items, and it was possible that Mrs. Whitman had moved the watch to a different location and had simply forgotten doing so. He assured her that he would look into the matter and asked her to contact him if the watch turned up, or if she remembered any additional details that might be relevant. 2 weeks later, Officer Park received another call that would begin to establish a pattern of unusual thefts in Cedar Falls. This time, the caller was Mr. Frank Morrison, a retired postal worker who lived 3 blocks away from Mrs. Whitman on Oak Street. Mr. Morrison reported that a silver pen set that had been given to him upon his retirement had disappeared from his home office. The pen set had considerable sentimental value to Mr. Morrison, as it had been presented to him by his colleagues after 35 years of faithful service delivering mail throughout Cedar Falls. The set consisted of a fountain pen and a ballpoint pen housed in a wooden presentation box, and Mr. Morrison had kept it on his desk in the small room he used as a home office for managing his personal finances and correspondence. Mr. Morrison's house was a modest ranch-style building that he had purchased when he first married 40 years earlier. He had lived there with his wife until her death 5 years previously, and he had since maintained the property alone with the help of neighbors and friends who assisted with tasks that had become difficult for him to manage independently. The house was always kept neat and organized, reflecting the methodical habits that had served him well during his postal career. The home office where the pen set had been kept was located at the front of the house, with a window that looked out over Oak Street. Mr. Morrison used the room daily to read his newspaper, pay bills, and write letters to family members and old friends from his working days. The desk was an old wooden piece that had belonged to his father, and he kept it arranged with careful attention to the placement of various items, including his checkbook, reading glasses, and the pen set that had now gone missing. Officer Park's examination of Mr. Morrison's house revealed the same puzzling absence of any signs of forced entry that had characterized the investigation at Mrs. Whitman's home. All doors and windows were properly secured, and nothing else in the house appeared to be missing or disturbed. Mr. Morrison's routine was quite regular, involving daily walks around the neighborhood, weekly trips to the grocery store and library, and occasional visits from his adult children who lived in nearby towns. The similarities between the two incidents began to suggest the possibility that Cedar Falls was experiencing a series of unusual thefts targeting items of personal rather than monetary value. Both Mrs. Whitman's watch and Mr. Morrison's pen set would have had minimal resale value to a typical burglar, yet both items held significant, sentimental importance to their owners and were kept in locations where they would be visible to anyone who entered the respective homes. A third incident occurred in early December when Mrs. Alice Chun, who lived on Pine Street near the center of town, discovered that a small ceramic figurine had disappeared from her living room mantelpiece. The figurine was a delicate piece depicting a shepherd with a small flock of sheep, and it had been a wedding gift from Mrs. Chun's grandmother. Over 40 years earlier, Mrs. Chun had kept the figurine in the same spot on her mantelpiece for the entire time she had lived in Cedar Falls, and she noticed its absence immediately when she was dusting her living room furniture. Mrs. Chun was 71 years old and lived with her husband, who suffered from early-stage dementia and required increasing amounts of care and supervision. The couple had moved to Cedar Falls 15 years earlier when Mr. Chun had retired from his position as an engineer with the State Highway Department. They had chosen the town specifically because of its quiet atmosphere and the availability of medical services that would support them as they aged. The Chun house was a two-story Victorian that they had purchased and carefully restored, paying particular attention to preserving the original architectural details while updating the electrical and plumbing systems for modern convenience. Mrs. Chun took great pride in maintaining the home's appearance, both inside and out, and she had developed a reputation among neighbors for her beautiful flower gardens and her meticulous attention to household organization. The living room where the figurine had been displayed was the formal gathering space that the Chuns used when entertaining guests and during their own quiet evening activities. The mantelpiece above the fireplace held a carefully arranged collection of family photographs, small decorative objects, and mementos from the couple's travels during Mr. Chun's working years. Each item had its designated place, and Mrs. Chun would have noticed immediately if anything was missing or had been moved from its usual position. Officer Park's investigation of the Chun house followed the same pattern as the previous incidents, revealing no signs of forced entry and no indication that anything else had been taken or disturbed. Mrs. Chun was certain about when she had last seen the figurine, as she dusted the mantelpiece every Saturday morning and recalled specifically cleaning around the piece just 4 days before discovering its absence. The Chuns had recently had several visitors, including a nurse who came twice a week to help with Mr. Chun's care, and Mrs. Chun's sister who had stayed for a weekend visit. Both of these individuals were well known to the family and had been in the house many times previously without any problems. The only unfamiliar person who had entered the house recently was a repair technician who had come to service their heating system, but he had worked only in the basement and had not been in the living room where the figurine was kept. As word of these unusual thefts began to spread through Cedar Falls, residents found themselves paying closer attention to their personal belongings and wondering if they too might become targets of whoever was responsible for the mysterious disappearances. The incidents had several troubling characteristics that set them apart from typical burglaries. The apparent ability of the thief to enter homes without leaving any trace of forced entry, the selection of items with sentimental rather than monetary value, and the precision with which single objects were taken while everything else remained undisturbed. Officer Park began conducting a more systematic investigation, visiting other elderly residents in the neighborhood to ask if they had noticed any missing items that they might not have reported to police. This canvassing effort revealed 2 additional incidents that had occurred, but had not been reported because the victims had assumed they had simply misplaced the missing objects. Mr. Robert Hayes, who lived on Elm Street, had been looking for a small brass compass that had belonged to his father during World War II. The compass had been kept in a wooden box on his bedroom dresser, along with other military memorabilia that Mr. Hayes treasured as reminders of his father's service. He had noticed the compass's absence several weeks earlier, but had assumed that he had moved it to a different location and had simply forgotten where he had put it. Mrs. Margaret Foster, who lived 2 blocks away on Birch Street, reported that a small silver locket containing photographs of her grandchildren had disappeared from her jewelry box. The locket had been a gift from her late husband on their 40th wedding anniversary, and she had worn it regularly until arthritis in her hands had made it difficult for her to manage the delicate clasp. She had been keeping it in her jewelry box on her bedroom dresser and had noticed its absence when she was looking for earrings to wear to church the previous Sunday. The pattern that emerged from these 5 incidents was both clear and disturbing. All of the victims were elderly residents living either alone or with spouses who required care. All of the missing items were small objects that could be easily concealed and carried away. None of the items had significant monetary value, but all held important sentimental meaning for their owners. Most significantly, none of the thefts had involved any signs of forced entry or any disturbance of other belongings in the homes. Officer Park expanded his investigation to include interviews with service providers who regularly visited elderly residents in Cedar Falls. This included postal workers, delivery drivers, home health care workers, and maintenance personnel who might have had opportunities to observe the interiors of multiple homes and to identify valuable or meaningful objects that could be targeted for theft. The investigation also extended to an examination of any strangers who had been seen in the neighborhoods where the thefts had occurred. Several residents reported having been approached by door-to-door salespeople or service providers in recent weeks, including the young man who had offered gutter cleaning services to Mrs. Whitman. These individuals were described in similar terms as being polite and well-dressed, but their identities and backgrounds remained unknown. As winter deepened and the investigation continued, the psychological impact of the thefts began to affect the daily lives of Cedar Falls residents in ways that went beyond the simple loss of the stolen objects. Elderly residents found themselves checking and rechecking the locations of their most treasured possessions, and many began taking photographs of valuable items as a way of documenting their presence in case they too disappeared. Mysteriously, the sense of security that had long characterized life in Cedar Falls was subtly undermined by the knowledge that someone was apparently able to enter homes at will and take objects that held deep personal meaning for their owners. The violation represented by these thefts felt more profound than typical burglaries because of the intimate nature of the items that had been taken and the precision with which they had been selected. Mrs. Whitman, whose missing watch had been the first reported incident, found herself struggling with feelings of vulnerability that were new to her experience of living in Cedar Falls. She had always felt safe in her home and in her community, but the disappearance of her husband's watch had introduced an element of uncertainty that affected her daily routines and her sense of well-being. The investigation took on additional urgency when Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Whitman's neighbor who held a spare key to her house, reported seeing an unfamiliar car parked on Maple Avenue during the afternoon when Mrs. Whitman had been at her weekly doctor's appointment. The car was described as a dark sedan with out-of-state license plates, and the driver had not been visible to Mrs. Patterson, who had observed the vehicle from her kitchen window. This sighting provided the first potential lead in the investigation, as it suggested that the thefts might be the work of someone who was conducting surveillance of potential victims and timing their activities to coincide with the residents' absences from their homes. Officer Park began working with residents to establish more detailed records of their daily routines and to identify times when their houses were predictably empty. The case took on regional significance when investigators discovered that similar thefts had been reported in 2 other small towns within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Falls. In each location, elderly residents had reported the disappearance of small sentimentally valuable objects from their homes, with no signs of forced entry and no disturbance of other belongings. The pattern suggested the work of someone who was systematically targeting small communities and preying on their most vulnerable residents. State police resources were brought into the investigation, including specialists in crimes against the elderly and experts in analyzing patterns of behavior that might help identify the perpetrator. The investigation revealed that the thefts had been occurring over a period of several months, with incidents reported in different towns but following the same general pattern of targeting elderly residents and taking objects of personal rather than monetary value. As the investigation continued into the early months of the following year, the mystery of the missing belongings remained unsolved, but the attention given to the case had resulted in increased awareness among elderly residents about the importance of securing their homes and being cautious about admitting strangers. Community organizations began offering programs on home security and crime prevention specifically designed for older residents. The thefts had introduced a new element of caution into the daily lives of Cedar Falls residents, but they had also strengthened the bonds of community as neighbors looked out for one another with increased vigilance and care. The investigation continued to follow leads and analyze patterns, working toward the goal of identifying and apprehending whoever was responsible for violating the homes and stealing the treasured possessions of the community's most respected residents. The mystery remained unsolved as winter gave way to spring, but the investigation had established clear patterns and procedures that would help protect other communities from similar crimes. The case served as a reminder that even the most peaceful towns could be vulnerable to predators who exploited the trust and openness that characterized small-town life, and it highlighted the importance of community vigilance in protecting the safety and security of all residents. Asterisk. The coastal city of Seabrook had always existed in harmony with the rhythms of the Atlantic Ocean, its streets rising and falling with the contours of the land as it sloped down toward the harbor, where fishing boats and pleasure craft bobbed gently at their moorings. The town's character was shaped by generations of families who had made their living from the sea, and even as tourism and other industries had gradually transformed the local economy, the fundamental connection between the community and the ocean remained unchanged. Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos had grown up in Seabrook and had returned to serve on the police force after completing her education and gaining experience in larger departments inland. She appreciated the way that crime in a coastal community often took on characteristics that reflected the transient nature of a place where strangers arrived by land and sea, stayed for varying periods of time, and then moved on to other destinations. The police files she maintained contained cases that would have been unusual in an inland community, involving as they did the complex jurisdictional questions that arose when crimes occurred on or near the water. On a misty morning in late October, Detective Santos found herself reviewing a collection of unsolved cases that had accumulated over the past 2 years, each involving circumstances that were puzzling in different ways, but that shared certain characteristics that had begun to seem significant when viewed as a group rather than as isolated incidents. The files were spread across her desk in the small office she occupied on the second floor of the police station, a building that had been constructed during the 1960s and renovated several times to accommodate changing needs and technologies. The first case that caught her attention involved the discovery of an abandoned sailboat that had been found drifting approximately 3 miles offshore during the previous summer. The vessel was a 32-foot sloop in excellent condition, with all safety equipment properly stowed and no signs of distress or emergency. The boat's registration had been traced to a marina in a coastal city 200 miles to the south, where it had been kept by its owner, a retired professor named Dr. William Hartley, who had been sailing alone when he departed that marina. 6 days before the boat was found, Dr. Hartley had filed a float plan indicating his intention to sail north along the coast, with planned stops at several harbors including Seabrook. His boat had been equipped with modern navigation and communication equipment, and weather conditions during the period of his voyage had been favorable for coastal sailing. The Coast Guard had conducted extensive searches of the area where the boat was found, but no trace of Dr. Hartley had been discovered despite the deployment of helicopters, search vessels, and teams of volunteer searchers. The condition of the abandoned sailboat had been particularly puzzling to investigators. The vessel showed no signs of damage or mechanical problems that might have caused an emergency. The sails had been properly furled, the anchor was secured, and all safety equipment remained in its designated storage locations. Personal belongings, including clothing, books, and navigation materials, were found neatly arranged in the cabin, exactly as one would expect to find them during a routine cruise. The only unusual aspect of the boat's condition was the absence of Dr. Hartley's logbook, which would normally have contained detailed records of his voyage, including weather observations, position reports, and notes about harbors visited. The missing logbook represented the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred aboard the vessel, as everything else appeared to be in perfect order. Dr. Hartley had been described by friends and family as an experienced sailor who had been cruising coastal waters for over 20 years. He was methodical in his approach to sailing and careful about safety procedures, always filing float plans and maintaining regular communication with shore-based contacts. His sudden disappearance was completely inconsistent with his cautious nature and his demonstrated competence as a mariner. The second case in Detective Santos's collection involved the discovery of a luxury automobile that had been found parked at a scenic overlook on the coastal highway north of Seabrook. The car, a late-model sedan with New York license plates, had been reported by a state trooper who noticed that it had remained in the same parking spot for several consecutive days. The vehicle was registered to Mr. James Crawford, a business executive from Manhattan who had apparently been traveling alone when he stopped at the overlook. Mr. Crawford's car had been found unlocked, with his personal belongings still inside, including his wallet, credit cards, and a significant amount of cash. His luggage was in the trunk, and nothing appeared to have been taken from the vehicle. The car keys were missing, but this detail seemed insignificant given that the car itself had been abandoned rather than stolen. The scenic overlook where the car was found was a popular stopping point for tourists and local residents who wanted to enjoy panoramic views of the ocean and the rocky coastline that stretched north and south from that vantage point. The area was easily accessible from the main highway, but it was also connected to several hiking trails that led down to secluded beaches and up to higher elevations. In the coastal hills, state police and local search teams had conducted thorough searches of the area around the overlook, including the trails and beaches that could be reached from that location. They had found no trace of Mr. Crawford or any evidence that might explain why he had abandoned his car and apparently wandered away on foot. The searches had been hampered by the rugged terrain and dense vegetation that characterized much of the coastal region, but experienced search teams had covered all accessible areas without discovering any clues. Mr. Crawford's family and business associates had been unable to provide any explanation for his presence in the Seabrook area, as his travel plans had not included any stops along the coast. He had left New York on what was supposed to be a business trip to Boston, and he had been expected to return within 3 days. His failure to arrive at his scheduled meetings and his subsequent disappearance had prompted missing person reports in multiple jurisdictions. Third case involved circumstances that were even more mysterious than the previous two. A fishing charter boat captain named Tony Reeves had discovered what appeared to be a complete campsite on a small island that was located approximately 5 miles offshore from Seabrook. The island was uninhabited and difficult to access due to strong currents and rocky shores. But Captain Reeves had landed there while seeking shelter during a sudden squall. The campsite consisted of a high-quality tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and several days' worth of food and water. All of the equipment appeared to be new and expensive, and it had been set up with obvious care and attention to detail. The campsite was located in a sheltered area near the center of the island, hidden from view from the water and protected from prevailing winds. What made the discovery particularly puzzling was the complete absence of any human presence on the island. Captain Reeves had searched the entire area, which was small enough to be thoroughly examined in less than an hour, but he had found no trace of whoever had established the campsite. The equipment showed no signs of having been used, and there were no footprints or other evidence of human activity beyond the initial setup of the camp. The island had no natural source of fresh water and no permanent shelter, making it an unlikely location for an extended stay. Access to the island required either a boat capable of navigating challenging waters or swimming skills, sufficient to cover a considerable distance in open ocean. Coast Guard personnel who later examined the site confirmed that the equipment was valuable and that considerable effort would have been required to transport it to the island and establish the campsite. Detective Santos had coordinated with Coast Guard investigators to examine the campsite more thoroughly, but their investigation had revealed no additional clues about who might have been responsible for establishing it or why they had apparently abandoned it without using any of the equipment. The tent and other gear were eventually removed from the island and stored as evidence, but no owner was ever identified despite extensive efforts to trace the purchase of the distinctive equipment. The fourth case in the collection involved the discovery of a motorcycle that had been found partially concealed in sand dunes near one of Seabrook's public beaches. The motorcycle was a touring model that had been reported stolen from a parking garage in Philadelphia 3 weeks before it was discovered. The bike had been carefully hidden among the dunes in a location that was not visible from the beach or from the access road that led to the parking area. The motorcycle's condition indicated that it had been ridden extensively before being abandoned, as the odometer showed several hundred additional miles beyond what would have been expected for the trip from Philadelphia to Seabrook. The bike had been stripped of some valuable components, including the GPS navigation system and custom touring accessories, but the basic vehicle remained intact and functional. Philadelphia police had investigated the original theft and determined that the motorcycle belonged to a retired teacher named Robert Martinez, who had planned to use it for a cross-country touring vacation. Mr. Martinez had reported the theft immediately upon discovering that his bike was missing from the secured parking garage where he kept it, and he had provided detailed descriptions of the custom accessories and modifications that made the motorcycle easily identifiable. Discovery of the motorcycle in Seabrook raised questions about the movements of whoever had stolen it and about their reasons for abandoning it in such a remote location. The effort required to hide the bike in the sand dunes suggested deliberate intent to conceal it rather than simple abandonment. The removal of valuable components indicated knowledge about which parts would be worth taking, but the decision to leave the motorcycle itself suggested that the thief had other means of transportation available. Detective Santos had worked with Philadelphia investigators to examine the motorcycle for evidence that might identify the thief or provide clues about where the bike had been taken during the period between its theft and its discovery in Seabrook. However, the exposure to salt air and sand had compromised most potential forensic evidence, and the investigation had not produced any significant leads. The fifth case involved the mysterious appearance of expensive camping equipment at a state park campground located inland from Seabrook. Park rangers had discovered a complete camping setup at a designated campsite, including a large family tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and recreational gear that would have cost several $1,000s if purchased new. The equipment appeared to have been used briefly and then abandoned, with no attempt made to pack it up or remove it from the campsite. The campground required advance reservations and payment of fees. but the site where the equipment was found had not been reserved for the dates when the gear was discovered. Park records showed no registration for that particular campsite during the relevant time period, and no one had reported seeing the equipment being set up or the people who might have been using it. The camping equipment was of professional quality and included specialized gear designed for extended backcountry use. Some items bore the labels of expensive outdoor retailers, and investigators attempted to trace their purchase through warranty registration and sales records. However, these efforts were unsuccessful, as the equipment appeared to have been purchased with cash from retailers that did not maintain detailed customer records. Park rangers had conducted searches of the surrounding area to determine if the equipment's owners might have been camping illegally in non-designated areas, but they found no evidence of unauthorized camping or any signs that might explain the presence of the abandoned gear. The equipment was eventually removed from the campsite and stored by park authorities, but no one ever came forward to claim it. As Detective Santos reviewed these 5 cases, she began to notice patterns that had not been apparent when each incident was investigated separately. All of the cases involved the abandonment of valuable property under circumstances that suggested deliberate rather than accidental loss. In each case, the abandoned items were in good condition and showed no signs of damage or emergency situations that might explain why they had been left behind. The geographical distribution of the cases was also significant, as all of the incidents had occurred within a relatively small area of the coast and its immediate inland region. The time frame for the cases spanned approximately 18 months, with incidents occurring at irregular intervals that showed no obvious seasonal pattern. Detective Santos began to develop a theory that the cases might be connected, possibly representing the work of someone who was systematically acquiring valuable property through theft or other illegal means and then abandoning it when it became inconvenient or risky to maintain possession. The theory would explain why items of obvious value had been left behind rather than sold or kept for personal use. Another possibility was that the abandoned property represented evidence of crimes that had been committed elsewhere, with the perpetrators bringing stolen or otherwise problematic items to the Seabrook area for disposal. The coastal location provided numerous opportunities for disposing of evidence, including access to deep water and remote areas where items might never be found. Investigation took on new dimensions when Detective Santos began coordinating with law enforcement agencies and other coastal communities to determine if similar patterns of abandoned property had been reported elsewhere. This expanded investigation revealed that several other jurisdictions had experienced comparable incidents involving valuable items that had been found under mysterious circumstances. The pattern that emerged from this broader investigation suggested the possibility of an organized group that was operating along the entire coastal region, moving stolen or otherwise illegally obtained property through a network of temporary storage and disposal sites. The theory would explain the high quality and value of the abandoned items, as well as the careful selection of remote or difficult to access locations where they were left. Detective Santos worked with federal investigators who specialized in interstate crime to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the potential scope and organization of the activities that might be responsible for the abandoned property cases. This collaboration brought additional resources to the investigation and provided access to databases and analytical tools that were beyond the capabilities of local law enforcement agencies. The investigation remained active as Detective Santos continued to document new cases and to analyze the patterns that connected them. The coastal location of Seabrook continued to make it an attractive area for criminal activities that took advantage of the community's accessibility to both land and sea transportation routes, and the police files continued to accumulate cases that reflected the unique challenges of law enforcement in a maritime environment. The mysteries surrounding the abandoned property cases served as a reminder of the complex criminal activities that could affect even small coastal communities. And they highlighted the importance of coordination between different law enforcement agencies in addressing crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The investigation would continue as new cases developed and as investigators worked to understand the full scope of the activities that had brought so much valuable abandoned property to the peaceful shores of Seabrook. Asterisk. The rural community of Pine Valley had always been particularly vulnerable to fire due to its location in the foothills where dense forests of pine and oak trees stretched for miles in every direction. The residents had learned to live with the constant awareness that wildfire was a natural part of their environment, and they had developed careful habits of maintaining defensible space around their homes and keeping emergency supplies ready for potential evacuations. However, during the autumn of a particularly dry year, they found themselves dealing with a series of small fires that appeared to be deliberately set, creating a new kind of anxiety that was unfamiliar to people who had always viewed fire as a natural rather than a criminal threat. Fire Captain Robert Martinez had been serving the Pine Valley Volunteer Fire Department for 15 years, and he had responded to hundreds of fires during his career, ranging from small grass fires that were quickly contained to major structure fires that had destroyed homes and businesses. His experience had taught him to recognize the characteristic signs of different types of fires, and he had developed an intuitive understanding of how fires behaved under various weather and terrain conditions. On a quiet Tuesday evening in late September, Captain Martinez received a call about a small grass fire burning on the hillside above the cemetery that served several communities in the Pine Valley area. The fire appeared to be contained to a relatively small area, but its location was concerning because it was uphill from the town and could potentially spread toward residential areas if wind conditions changed. The cemetery itself was located on a gently sloping hillside that provided views of the entire valley below. It was a peaceful place that had been serving the community for over a century, with weathered headstones marking the graves of pioneers, farmers, and families who had built their lives in this rural area. The cemetery was maintained by a volunteer committee and was visited regularly by community members who came to tend family graves and to enjoy the quiet atmosphere of the location. When the fire crew arrived at the cemetery, they found a grass fire burning in a roughly circular pattern, approximately 50 feet in diameter. The fire was consuming dry grass and small shrubs, but it had not yet reached any of the mature trees that bordered the cemetery grounds. The flames were relatively low and appeared to be moving slowly, suggesting that wind conditions were favorable for containment. As Captain Martinez and his crew worked to suppress the fire using water and hand tools, he began to notice characteristics that seemed unusual for a typical grass fire. The burn pattern was remarkably uniform, forming an almost perfect circle rather than the irregular shape that would be expected from a fire that had started from a single ignition point and spread naturally according to wind and terrain conditions. The fire appeared to have multiple origin points around the perimeter of the burned area, which suggested the possibility of deliberate ignition rather than natural causes such as lightning or accidental ignition from human activities. Captain Martinez had seen similar patterns in structure fires that had been deliberately set, but he had never encountered such characteristics in a wildland fire. After the fire was completely extinguished and the area was thoroughly checked for any remaining hot spots, Captain Martinez conducted a careful examination of the burn area to look for evidence that might explain the unusual ignition pattern. His investigation revealed what appeared to be the remains of several small ignition devices that had been placed at regular intervals around the perimeter of what would become the burned area. The devices appeared to be simple constructions consisting of matches, paper, and some form of accelerant, but they had been arranged with obvious planning and forethought. Someone had apparently visited the cemetery site earlier and had prepared a coordinated ignition system that would create multiple starting points for the fire simultaneously. Captain Martinez documented his findings carefully and contacted the county sheriff's department to report the possibility that the fire had been deliberately set. This was the beginning of an investigation that would eventually encompass more than a dozen suspicious fires over the following 2 months, each displaying characteristics that suggested deliberate ignition by someone who possessed knowledge of fire behavior and techniques for creating reliable ignition systems. Sheriff Deputy Amanda Chun responded to Captain Martinez's report about the cemetery fire and began an investigation that would require her to develop expertise in fire investigation techniques that went beyond her usual law enforcement training. Deputy Chun had grown up in Pine Valley and had chosen to serve her community as a law enforcement officer after completing her education and gaining experience in urban police departments. The investigation of the cemetery fire involved careful documentation of the burn area, collection of evidence from the suspected ignition devices, and interviews with community members who might have observed suspicious activity in the area during the days leading up to the fire. Deputy Chun's methodical approach reflected the serious nature of arson charges and the potential danger that deliberate fire setting posed to the entire community. The interviews revealed that several people had noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near the cemetery during the previous week, but the descriptions were vague and no one had recorded license plate numbers or other identifying information. The cemetery was accessible by a public road and was visited regularly by people from throughout the region, so the presence of unfamiliar vehicles was not considered unusual enough to warrant special attention. 2 weeks after the cemetery fire, Captain Martinez received another call about a small grass fire burning on public land near the elementary school that served Pine Valley and several surrounding communities. The fire was located in an open field that was used by students for outdoor activities and by community members for recreational purposes such as walking and jogging. The response to this second fire followed the same pattern as the cemetery incident, with Captain Martinez and his crew arriving to find a grass fire burning in a remarkably uniform circular pattern. The fire was larger than the previous incident, covering approximately an acre of grassland, but it was still contained to an area where it posed minimal immediate threat to structures or important natural resources. Captain Martinez's investigation of the second fire revealed the same type of evidence that had been found at the cemetery site. Remains of multiple small ignition devices that had been placed strategically around the perimeter of what would become the burned area. The devices appeared to be constructed using similar materials and techniques, suggesting that both fires had been set by the same person or group of people. The location of the second fire was particularly concerning because of its proximity to the elementary school and the potential danger it could have posed to children if it had occurred during school hours or had spread beyond the intended burn area. The school principal, Mrs. Sarah Johnson, expressed alarm about the possibility that someone was deliberately setting fires near facilities used by children. Deputy Chun's investigation of the second fire expanded to include interviews with school staff, parents, and community members who used the recreational field where the fire had occurred. These interviews revealed that several people had noticed individuals walking in the field during evening hours in the days preceding the fire. But again, the descriptions were not detailed enough to identify specific suspects. The pattern of deliberate fire setting continued with a third incident that occurred on a hillside near the Pine Valley Community Center, a building that served as a gathering place for various social and civic activities. The fire followed the same characteristics as the previous incidents, burning in a circular pattern and showing evidence of multiple coordinated ignition points. This third fire was discovered by community center custodian Tom Wilson, who had been working late to prepare the building for a wedding reception scheduled for the following day. Mr. Wilson had noticed the glow of flames through the building's windows and had immediately called the fire department before attempting to determine the extent and location of the fire. Captain Martinez's response to the community center fire revealed a blaze that was somewhat larger than the previous incidents, but that showed the same deliberate ignition pattern. The fire was burning in grass and brush on a hillside that sloped away from the community center building, reducing the immediate threat to the structure, but creating the potential for the fire to spread toward residential areas located further down the hillside. The suppression of this third fire required additional resources, including mutual aid from neighboring fire departments and coordination with county fire suppression aircraft that dropped water and fire retardant on the advancing flames. Increased scale of the response reflected growing concern about the potential for these deliberately set fires to escape control and cause significant damage to homes and natural resources. Deputy Chun's investigation of the community center fire included examination of the burn area after it had cooled sufficiently for safe access. Her investigation revealed not only the same type of ignition devices that had been found at the previous sites, but also evidence that the perpetrator had conducted reconnaissance of the area before setting the fire. Footprints and disturbed vegetation indicated that someone had walked the perimeter of the area that would eventually burn, apparently planning the placement of ignition devices and assessing factors such as wind, direction, and the availability of fuel for the fire. This evidence suggested a level of planning and expertise that went beyond simple vandalism or random fire setting. Fourth fire in the series occurred near the Pine Valley Post Office, in a vacant lot that was scheduled for development as a small shopping center. The fire burned approximately 2 acres of grass and brush before being contained by fire crews, but it came close enough to the post office building to cause concern about potential damage to this essential community. Facility. Postmaster Linda Rodriguez reported that she had been working late to process mail deliveries when she noticed the smell of smoke and had seen flames in the vacant lot behind the post office building. Her quick notification of the fire department had enabled a rapid response that prevented the fire from spreading to the building or to nearby businesses. The investigation of the post office fire revealed the same pattern of evidence that had characterized the previous incidents, but it also uncovered additional information that would prove significant to the overall investigation. Tire tracks in the soft soil near the fire site indicated that the perpetrator had driven a vehicle close to the ignition area, possibly to transport materials or to provide a quick escape route after setting the fire. Deputy Chun worked with state investigators who specialized in tire track analysis to document the evidence and to attempt to identify the type of vehicle that had made the tracks. The analysis revealed that the tracks had been made by a light truck or SUV with a distinctive tread pattern that might be useful for identifying the vehicle if it could be located. The fifth fire occurred on private property belonging to the Hendricks family, who operated a small ranch on the outskirts of Pine Valley. The fire burned pasture land that was used for grazing cattle, and while it did not threaten any buildings, it destroyed valuable forage that the family depended on for their livestock operation. Asterisk. Ranch owner Bill Hendricks discovered the fire early in the morning when he went out to check on his cattle and saw smoke rising from the far end of his pasture. His immediate notification of the fire department enabled a quick response, but the fire had already burned approximately 3 acres of grassland before it could be contained. The investigation of the Hendricks Ranch fire revealed evidence that the perpetrator had cut through a fence to access the private property, indicating a willingness to commit trespassing and property damage beyond the fire-setting activities. The cut fence also suggested that the perpetrator was carrying tools that would enable them to overcome barriers that might prevent access to targeted areas. Mr. Hendricks reported that he had not noticed any suspicious activity on his property in the days before the fire, but he acknowledged that the ranch covered several hundred acres and that it would be possible for someone to enter the property without being observed. The remote location of the ranch made surveillance difficult and provided the perpetrator with opportunities to conduct planning activities without detection. As the series of deliberately set fires continued, The Pine Valley community began to experience a level of anxiety and concern that was unprecedented in their experience with wildfire threats. Residents found themselves paying closer attention to unusual activities in their neighborhoods and reporting suspicious behavior to law enforcement officials with greater frequency. Captain Martinez worked with fire departments in neighboring communities to establish increased patrols and surveillance of areas that might be vulnerable to additional fire-setting activities. This coordination involved sharing information about the techniques and patterns that had been observed in the Pine Valley fires and developing strategies for rapid response to new incidents. The investigation expanded to include consultation with federal agencies that specialized in arson investigation and prevention. These resources brought additional expertise in behavioral analysis and investigative techniques that were specifically designed for cases involving serial arson activities. FBI Special Agent Patricia Wong was assigned to coordinate federal resources for the Pine Valley fire investigation, bringing with her extensive experience in analyzing patterns of criminal behavior and techniques for identifying perpetrators of serial crimes. Her involvement represented an escalation in the seriousness with which law enforcement agencies viewed the deliberate fire-setting activities. Agent Wong's analysis of the Pine Valley fires identified several characteristics that provided insights into the likely personality and motivations of the perpetrator. The careful planning and execution of the fires suggested someone with patience, attention to detail, and possible experience with fire suppression or wildland fire behavior. The selection of targets also revealed patterns that might be significant for the investigation. All of the fires had been set in locations that were highly visible to the community, but that posed limited immediate threat to major structures or populated areas. This suggested that the perpetrator might be seeking attention or attempting to create fear without causing catastrophic damage. The timing of the fires also showed patterns that could be useful for identifying the perpetrator. All of the incidents had occurred during evening hours on weekdays, suggesting that the fire setter might have a regular work schedule that limited their availability for conducting these activities during other times. Investigation eventually led to increased surveillance of potential target areas and the deployment of hidden cameras that could document any suspicious activities around locations where fires might be set. This surveillance required careful coordination between multiple agencies and the use of specialized equipment that could operate effectively in outdoor environments. The breakthrough in the case came when surveillance cameras captured images of an individual placing ignition devices in an area that matched the pattern of previous fire locations. The images were clear enough to enable identification of the perpetrator as Marcus Thompson, a 38-year-old man who worked for a landscaping company that provided services throughout the Pine Valley region. Thompson's employment with the landscaping company had given him detailed knowledge of the local area and access to many of the locations where fires had been set. His work schedule explained the timing of the fire-setting activities, as he was typically finished with his landscaping duties by late afternoon and had time available during evening hours. The investigation of Thompson's background revealed a history of fascination with fire and previous incidents of suspicious behavior that had not been reported to law enforcement officials. Co-workers at the landscaping company reported that Thompson had often discussed wildfire behavior and had seemed unusually interested in news reports about fire incidents in the region. Thompson was arrested and charged with multiple counts of arson, and the evidence against him included the surveillance footage, physical evidence from the fire scenes, and tire track evidence that matched his vehicle. His arrest brought an end to the series of deliberately set fires that had troubled the Pine Valley community for several months. The successful resolution of the arson case provided relief to residents who had been concerned about the threat of deliberately set fires and had been taking extra precautions to protect their property and families. The investigation had demonstrated the effectiveness of coordination between local fire departments, law enforcement agencies, and federal specialists in addressing complex criminal activities. The case also highlighted the importance of community vigilance and cooperation in identifying suspicious activities and providing information that could assist law enforcement investigations. The residents of Pine Valley had played important roles in the investigation by reporting unusual activities and cooperating with investigators who were working to identify and apprehend the arsonist. Captain Martinez and Deputy Chun continued their work in Pine Valley with enhanced awareness of the potential for deliberately set fires and improved procedures for investigating suspicious fire incidents. Their experience with the arson case had provided them with valuable skills and knowledge that would benefit future investigations and fire prevention efforts. The resolution of the case had protected the Pine Valley community from additional fire threats and had preserved the safety and security that residents valued in their rural mountain environment. The investigation had demonstrated that even small communities could successfully address serious criminal threats through the coordinated efforts of dedicated public safety professionals and engaged community members. The mountain town of Clearwater had always worn winter like a familiar old coat, with snow beginning to dust the peaks in October and settling into the valleys by Thanksgiving, to remain until the spring thaw revealed the landscape once again. The town's economy depended heavily on winter tourism, with visitors arriving to enjoy skiing, snowmobiling, and other cold weather activities that brought vital income to local businesses during the months when outdoor work was impossible and many residents struggled to make ends meet. Detective Sarah Coleman had moved to Clearwater 5 years earlier, drawn by the community's peaceful atmosphere and the opportunity to serve as one of only 3 full-time law enforcement officers in a town where serious crime had historically been rare. Her background included experience with urban police departments, where she had handled complex investigations, but she had found satisfaction in the more personal, community-oriented approach to police work that was possible in a small mountain town. The winter that would challenge Detective Coleman's assumptions about her quiet community began normally enough, with the first substantial snowfall occurring in mid-November and continuing intermittently until the town was blanketed in the thick, white covering that would define daily life until spring. The snow brought with it the usual minor problems of traffic accidents, power outages, and occasional domestic disputes that tended to increase when people were confined indoors for extended periods. However, by early December, Detective Coleman had begun to notice a pattern of small thefts that seemed unusual, both for their frequency and for the specific types of items that were being taken. The thefts were not random acts of petty crime, but appeared to be carefully planned activities that targeted particular businesses and residences for specific goods that would be difficult to trace once they had been stolen. The first theft that attracted Detective Coleman's attention occurred at Henderson's hardware store, a family-owned business that had served the Clearwater community for over 40 years. The store stocked everything from basic household supplies to specialized equipment used by local contractors and seasonal workers, and it had developed a reputation for carrying items that were difficult to find elsewhere in the mountain region. Store owner Jim Henderson discovered the theft when he arrived to open for business on a Monday morning in early December and found that someone had broken into his store during the weekend and had taken a very specific selection of merchandise. The stolen items included several high-quality sleeping bags, portable camping stoves, water purification equipment, and other gear that would be essential for outdoor survival in winter conditions. What made the theft particularly puzzling was the apparent knowledge that the burglar had demonstrated about which items to take and where to find them in the store. The stolen merchandise had been selected from different areas of the building, suggesting that the thief had either visited the store previously as a customer or had spent considerable time inside. During the burglary, conducting a careful inventory of available items, Detective Coleman's investigation of the hardware store theft revealed that the burglar had gained entry through a rear door that was not visible from the street, using tools to defeat the lock without causing obvious damage that would have been noticed by passing patrol officers. The break-in had been conducted with obvious skill and planning, indicating someone with experience in such activities or training in techniques for gaining unauthorized entry to buildings. Mr. Henderson reported that the stolen merchandise had a retail value of approximately $2,000, but he was more concerned about the selective nature of the theft than about the financial loss. The burglar had ignored valuable power tools, electronics, and other merchandise that would have been much easier to sell, instead taking only items that would be useful for outdoor survival activities. The investigation expanded when Detective Coleman learned that similar thefts had occurred at 2 other businesses in Clearwater during the same weekend. Mountain Sports Equipment, which specialized in gear for skiing and other winter activities, had been burglarized with the theft of winter clothing, boots, and accessories that would enable someone to remain warm and dry in harsh winter conditions. Clearwater Grocery, the town's main food store, had also been broken into, with the theft focusing on non-perishable food items, medical supplies, and other goods that could be stored for extended periods without refrigeration. The selection of stolen items suggested someone who was planning for an extended period of self-sufficiency in conditions where normal sources of food and supplies would not be available. Detective Coleman began to develop a theory that the thefts were being conducted by someone who was preparing for an extended period of hiding or living outdoors in the mountain wilderness that surrounded Clearwater. This theory was supported by the specific nature of the stolen items and by the knowledge and skills that the burglar had demonstrated in conducting the thefts without being detected. The investigation took on additional urgency when Detective Coleman learned from state police contacts that similar patterns of theft had been reported in other mountain communities throughout the region. In each case, the stolen items were consistent with preparations for outdoor survival, and the burglaries were conducted with skill and planning that suggested an experienced perpetrator. State Police Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos was assigned to coordinate the regional investigation and to work with local law enforcement agencies to identify patterns that might lead to the apprehension of whoever was responsible for the coordinated series of thefts. Detective Santos brought with her extensive experience in investigating organized criminal activities and resources for analyzing evidence that were beyond the capabilities of small-town police departments. The coordinated investigation revealed that the thefts had been occurring over a period of several months, beginning in early autumn and continuing through the early winter period. The pattern suggested systematic preparation by someone who understood that winter conditions would provide both challenges and opportunities for remaining hidden from law enforcement activities. Detective Coleman worked with Detective Santos to analyze the specific items that had been stolen and to develop a profile of someone who possessed knowledge about outdoor survival techniques and experience with wilderness activities. The stolen merchandise included specialized equipment that would not be familiar to casual outdoors enthusiasts, suggesting someone with military training, extensive camping experience, or professional involvement in outdoor recreation industries. The investigation expanded to include interviews with local residents who had experience with wilderness activities and who might have observed suspicious behavior or recognized individuals who possessed the skills necessary to survive extended periods outdoors in winter conditions. These interviews revealed several individuals who had recently moved to the area and who had backgrounds that could be relevant to the investigation. One person of particular interest was Marcus Thompson, a former military serviceman who had moved to Clearwater 6 months earlier and who had been seeking employment in construction and outdoor recreation businesses. Thompson had specialized training in wilderness survival and had served in military units that operated in harsh environmental conditions similar to those found in the mountain region around Clearwater. However, Detective Coleman's investigation of Thompson revealed that he had been working steadily since arriving in Clearwater and had established a reputation as a reliable employee who was well regarded by his supervisors and co-workers. His military service record was exemplary, and he had no history of criminal activity that would suggest involvement in the theft activities. Another individual who attracted investigative attention was Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 30s, who had moved to Clearwater earlier in the year and who had been working as a seasonal employee at various businesses that catered to winter tourists. Walsh had extensive experience with outdoor activities and had been observed by several residents conducting what appeared to be recreational hiking and camping activities in the wilderness areas around the town. Detective Coleman's investigation of Walsh revealed that she had been struggling financially since arriving in Clearwater and that she had been working multiple part-time jobs to support herself. Her outdoor activities could be explained as legitimate recreational pursuits, and she had no criminal history that would suggest involvement in theft activities. Asterisk. As the investigation continued through the winter months, additional thefts occurred that followed the same pattern of targeting items useful for outdoor survival. The cumulative value of stolen merchandise approached $10,000, representing a significant impact on local businesses that depended on winter tourist season revenue to sustain their operations through the year. The thefts were having a broader impact on the Clearwater community beyond their direct financial cost. Business owners were investing in additional security measures and were altering their routines to minimize their vulnerability to break-ins. Residents were becoming more suspicious of strangers and were reporting unusual activities to police with increased frequency. Detective Coleman found herself working longer hours and coordinating with law enforcement agencies throughout the region as the investigation expanded to encompass what appeared to be a coordinated criminal enterprise. The case was consuming significant resources and was attracting attention from media outlets that were covering the story of mysterious thefts in mountain communities. The investigation took a significant turn when a witness came forward with information about suspicious activity that had been observed in a remote area of wilderness approximately 15 miles from Clearwater. Cross-country skier David Kim reported that he had discovered what appeared to be a well-concealed campsite in a location that was far from any marked trails or areas typically visited by recreational users. Asterisk. Mr. Kim's report described a sophisticated survival setup that included a camouflage shelter, carefully concealed supply caches, and evidence of long-term occupation by someone who possessed advanced wilderness survival skills. The location was accessible only by cross-country skiing or snowshoeing, and would have been virtually impossible for law enforcement officers to discover through normal patrol activities. Detective Coleman organized a team of officers with winter wilderness training to investigate the reported campsite, bringing with them equipment and expertise necessary for operating safely in remote mountain terrain during winter conditions. The expedition required careful planning and coordination with search and rescue personnel who could provide emergency assistance if needed. The investigation team's examination of the remote campsite revealed clear evidence that it had been occupied for an extended period by someone who had invested considerable effort in establishing a sustainable wilderness shelter. The site included multiple supply caches, sophisticated heating and cooking arrangements, and defensive measures that would make it difficult to approach without being detected. Most significantly, for the theft investigation, the campsite contained merchandise that matched items stolen from businesses in Clearwater and other mountain communities. The recovered goods included clothing, equipment, and supplies that could be positively identified through serial numbers and other distinctive characteristics documented by the victimized businesses. The discovery of the campsite represented a major breakthrough in the investigation. but it also raised new questions about the motivations and background of whoever had established such an elaborate wilderness hideout. The level of skill and planning evident in the campsite suggested someone with extensive experience in wilderness survival and possibly military or law enforcement training. The campsite was unoccupied when investigators discovered it, but evidence indicated that its occupant had departed recently, possibly within the previous few days. Fresh tracks in the snow led away from the site toward even more remote areas of the wilderness, suggesting that whoever had been living there had become aware of increased law enforcement activity and had abandoned their carefully constructed shelter. Detective Coleman worked with tracking specialists to follow the trail left by the campsite's former occupant, but the tracks eventually disappeared on rocky terrain where snow had not accumulated sufficiently to preserve clear footprints. The tracking effort revealed that whoever they were, pursuing possessed advanced knowledge of techniques for avoiding detection and covering their movements through wilderness terrain. The investigation of the abandoned campsite provided valuable evidence about the theft activities and the person responsible for them, but it also revealed disturbing information about the level of planning and preparation that had gone into establishing the remote hideout. The sophisticated nature of the survival setup suggested someone who had been planning this activity for months or possibly years. Among the items recovered from the campsite were detailed maps of the region, marked with locations of businesses, residences, and other targets that had been or might have been selected for theft activities. The map showed a level of reconnaissance and planning that went far beyond opportunistic criminal behavior, indicating systematic preparation for an extended campaign of survival-oriented thefts. Campsite also contained notebooks with detailed observations about the daily routines of Clearwater residents, the schedules of local businesses, and the patrol patterns of law enforcement officers. This information had obviously been gathered through careful surveillance activities conducted over an extended period of time. Detective Santos worked with federal investigators who specialized in analyzing evidence related to individuals who had chosen to live outside normal society and who supported themselves through criminal activities. This consultation provided insights into behavioral patterns and motivations that might help identify the person responsible for the Clearwater thefts. The federal analysis suggested that the campsite's former occupant was likely someone with significant outdoor experience, who had become alienated from conventional society and had chosen to survive through theft rather than seeking legal employment or social assistance. The level of preparation and skill evident in the survival setup indicated possible military or law enforcement background. As winter progressed towards spring, the investigation continued to follow leads and analyze evidence recovered from the abandoned campsite. Additional thefts had stopped occurring after the discovery of the hideout, suggesting that the perpetrator had either left the region or had found alternative means of obtaining necessary supplies. The case attracted attention from criminologists and wilderness survival experts who were interested in studying the sophisticated techniques that had been employed in establishing and maintaining the remote campsite. Academic researchers requested access to evidence and documentation from the investigation for use in studies of criminal behavior and survival psychology. Detective Coleman found herself participating in conferences and training programs where law enforcement officers from rural and wilderness areas shared information about similar cases and discussed strategies for preventing and investigating crimes committed by individuals who chose to live outside normal society. Clearwater theft investigation had broader implications for understanding how criminal activities could be conducted in wilderness areas where traditional law enforcement techniques were less effective. The case highlighted the need for specialized training and equipment that would enable officers to pursue investigations in remote terrain during harsh weather conditions. Investigation also revealed vulnerabilities in small mountain communities that could be exploited by individuals with advanced wilderness survival skills. The pattern of thefts had targeted essential supplies for outdoor survival while avoiding items that would be more valuable for traditional criminal enterprises. Focused on financial gain. As spring arrived and snow began to melt in the lower elevations around Clearwater, search teams were able to access previously inaccessible areas where the mysterious campsite occupant might have established additional hideouts or supply caches. These expanded searches revealed several smaller campsites that had been used temporarily, suggesting a pattern of movement through the wilderness that had enabled the perpetrator to avoid detection for an extended period. Investigation had consumed significant resources from multiple law enforcement agencies and had required coordination between local, state, and federal investigators with different areas of expertise. The case served as a learning experience for developing procedures and techniques that could be applied to similar investigations in other wilderness areas. Local businesses in Clearwater had recovered most of their stolen merchandise from the abandoned campsite, but the investigation had revealed their vulnerability to future thefts conducted by individuals with similar skills and motivations. Many business owners had invested in improved security systems and had modified their procedures for securing valuable merchandise. The community impact of the investigation extended beyond its direct effects on victimized businesses. Residents had become more aware of the possibility that individuals might be living undetected in the wilderness areas that surrounded their town, and they had developed increased vigilance about reporting suspicious activities to law enforcement officials. Detective Coleman continued to monitor regional law enforcement communications for reports of similar theft patterns that might indicate that the Clearwater perpetrator had relocated to other areas. The distinctive characteristics of the crimes and the sophisticated survival techniques employed by the perpetrator created a profile that would be recognizable if similar activities occurred elsewhere. The case remained officially open as investigators continued to pursue leads and analyze evidence, but the immediate threat to the Clearwater community appeared to have ended with the discovery and abandonment of the remote campsite. The investigation had provided valuable experience and training for law enforcement officers who might encounter similar situations in other wilderness communities. The mystery of the Clearwater winter thefts had revealed the complex challenges that could arise when traditional criminal investigation techniques were applied to cases involving individuals who possessed advanced wilderness survival skills and who had chosen to operate outside normal social and economic systems. The case had demonstrated the importance of specialized training and interagency cooperation in addressing crimes that occurred in remote and challenging environments. Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? The industrial district on the east side of Riverside had been gradually emptying for more than a decade as manufacturing companies relocated their operations to regions with lower costs and newer facilities. What remained was a landscape of abandoned warehouses, empty factory buildings, and overgrown lots that had once hummed with the activity of workers and machinery, but now stood silent beneath the changing sky, their broken windows reflecting the seasons as they passed. Detective Lieutenant James Morrison had been assigned to the East District Patrol for 3 years, and he had become familiar with the gradual deterioration of buildings that had once represented the economic foundation of his community. His regular patrols took him through streets lined with structures that showed the accumulated effects of weather, vandalism, and simple neglect, creating an urban wilderness that was both fascinating and troubling. On a gray morning in early November, Detective Morrison received a call from the security guard who was responsible for maintaining basic surveillance of the abandoned Riverside manufacturing complex, a sprawling collection of buildings that had once employed over 500 workers producing automotive components. The complex had been closed for 7 years, and its owner was in the process of negotiating its sale to a development company that planned to demolish the existing structures and build a modern distribution center. Security guard Tom Wilson reported that he had discovered evidence of unauthorized entry into one of the abandoned buildings during his routine morning inspection. Mr. Wilson had been providing security services for the complex since it had been closed, making regular patrols to ensure that the buildings remained secure and that vandalism or illegal activities were kept to a minimum. Detective Morrison responded to the call and met Mr. Wilson at the main gate of the manufacturing complex, which was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that was intended to prevent unauthorized access. The security guard explained that he had been conducting his usual inspection when he noticed that a door at the rear of Building C had been forced open, apparently during the previous night. Building C had been the main assembly facility during the complex's operational years, and it was the largest structure on the property, containing over 50,000 square feet of open floor space beneath a roof supported by massive steel beams. The building had been stripped of most valuable equipment and materials when the facility was closed, but it still contained the basic infrastructure of an industrial operation, including electrical systems, plumbing, and overhead crane systems. Detective Morrison followed Mr. Wilson through the forced door into the interior of Building C, where they found evidence of recent human activity that went far beyond simple trespassing or vandalism. Someone had been using the abandoned space as a temporary shelter and had made modifications to the building that suggested a longer-term occupation than would be typical for transient individuals seeking overnight accommodation. The evidence of occupation was concentrated in a corner of the building where concrete block walls created a partially enclosed area that had originally housed electrical equipment. This space had been converted into a rudimentary living area, with sleeping materials, cooking equipment, and personal belongings arranged in a way that suggested careful organization and planning. What made the discovery particularly intriguing was the apparent effort that had been made to conceal the occupation from casual observation. The living area was located in a part of the building that was not visible from windows or doors, and access to it required following a specific route through the interior that would not be obvious to anyone conducting a quick inspection of the premises. Detective Morrison documented the living area carefully, taking photographs and notes that recorded the specific items that had been left behind and the modifications that had been made to the original building structure. The evidence suggested that the space had been occupied for a considerable period of time, possibly several weeks or months, rather than just a few nights. The personal belongings found in the makeshift living area included clothing, books, and other items that provided clues about the individual or individuals who had been using the space. The clothing appeared to be men's garments in medium sizes, and the books included technical manuals related to industrial equipment and electrical systems, suggesting someone with specialized knowledge or professional experience in those areas. Mr. Wilson reported that he had not noticed any signs of unauthorized access to the complex during his previous inspections, which were conducted 3 times per week. The concealment of the living area and the careful approach that had been taken to avoiding detection suggested that whoever had been occupying the space possessed knowledge about security procedures and surveillance techniques. Detective Morrison expanded his investigation to include examination of other buildings within the abandoned manufacturing complex, looking for additional evidence of unauthorized occupation or activities that might be related to the discovery. In building, the mountain village of Cedar Ridge sat nestled in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose like ancient guardians against the sky, their slopes covered with dense forests of pine and fir that changed colors with the seasons and provided a backdrop of natural beauty that had drawn settlers to the area over a century earlier. The village had grown slowly over the generations, developing from a logging camp into a small but stable community that balanced respect for its mountain environment with the practical needs of residents who had chosen to make their lives in this remote and Challenging location. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos had been serving Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountain communities for 12 years, covering a patrol area that encompassed hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain where scattered residences, small businesses, and seasonal cabins were connected by winding roads that followed the contours of the landscape. Her work required her to be part law enforcement officer, part social worker, and part mountain rescue specialist, as the isolation and self-reliance that characterized mountain life often meant that she was the first and sometimes only official responder to a wide variety of situations. The nature of law enforcement in a mountain village was different from police work in urban areas, involving longer response times, greater distances between incidents, and residents who often preferred to handle their problems independently rather than seeking help from outside authorities. Deputy Santos had learned to approach her work with patience and understanding, recognizing that successful policing in a mountain community required building trust and maintaining relationships that might be called upon in emergency situations. During the autumn of her 12th year of service in Cedar Ridge, Deputy Santos found herself investigating a series of incidents that would challenge her understanding of the community she had served for so long, and would reveal historical connections between past events and current circumstances that had not been apparent during her years of routine patrol work. The investigation began when Eleanor Mitchell, an 84-year-old resident who had lived in Cedar Ridge for over 60 years, contacted Deputy Santos about some unusual discoveries she had made while cleaning out the attic of her family's mountain cabin. Mrs. Mitchell had been preparing to move to an assisted living facility in the valley below, and was sorting through decades of accumulated possessions when she found a collection of documents that seemed to relate to criminal activities that had occurred in the area during the 1970s. Mrs. Mitchell's family had owned property in Cedar Ridge since the 1920s, when her grandfather had purchased several hundred acres of mountainous land for use as a summer retreat and hunting preserve. Over the decades, the family had built cabins, cleared trails, and developed the property into a compound that had served multiple generations as a gathering place for vacations and family celebrations. The documents that Mrs. Mitchell had discovered were contained in a wooden box that had been stored in a corner of the attic beneath other family belongings. The box contained newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be official reports related to a series of crimes that had occurred in the Cedar Ridge area during the mid-1970s. Deputy Santos responded to Mrs. Mitchell's call and examined the documents carefully, finding them to be a fascinating collection of materials that provided insights into criminal activities that had apparently been investigated by law enforcement agencies decades earlier. The document suggested that Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountain areas had been the site of significant criminal operations that had not been widely known to local residents. The newspaper clippings included articles from regional newspapers that reported on federal investigations of illegal activities in remote mountain areas, including drug manufacturing operations, weapons trafficking, and other crimes that had taken advantage of the isolation and difficult access that characterized much of the mountain region. The handwritten notes appeared to have been made by someone who had been observing and documenting suspicious activities in the Cedar Ridge area over a period of several months. The notes included detailed descriptions of vehicles, license plate, numbers, and individuals who had been seen in locations where they might not have been expected to have legitimate business. The photographs in the collection showed various locations in the Cedar Ridge area, including some that Deputy Santos recognized as remote areas of the mountain where few people would normally have reason to visit. Some of the photographs appeared to show structures or modifications to natural features that suggested human activities that might have been related to the criminal operations described in the newspaper articles. The official reports in the collection appeared to be copies of law enforcement documents that detailed investigations of criminal activities in mountain areas, including specific references to the Cedar Ridge region and surrounding communities. The report suggested that federal agencies had conducted extensive operations in the area during the 1970s that had resulted in arrests and prosecutions of individuals involved in various illegal enterprises. Deputy Santos recognized that the documents represented potentially significant historical information about criminal activities that had affected her patrol area, but she also understood that the materials might contain information that was relevant to current law enforcement concerns or that might provide insights into ongoing problems in the mountain region. She contacted her supervisor, Sheriff Robert Chun, to report the discovery and to discuss the appropriate way to handle the historical documents while ensuring that any current law enforcement implications were properly addressed. Sheriff Chun had served in mountain law enforcement for over 20 years and had institutional knowledge about historical criminal activities that might be relevant to interpreting the discovered materials. Sheriff Chun examined the documents and confirmed that they appeared to be authentic materials related to federal investigations that had occurred during the 1970s. He recalled that senior officers had occasionally mentioned historical criminal activities in the mountain region, but the specific details had not been widely documented or preserved in current departmental records. The investigation of the historical documents led Sheriff Chen and Deputy Santos to contact federal agencies that might have been involved in the original investigations and that might have institutional records that could provide additional context for understanding the materials that Mrs. Mitchell had discovered. FBI Special Agent Patricia Wong was assigned to coordinate federal response to the inquiry about the historical documents, bringing with her access to archived federal case files and databases that might contain information related to the Cedar Ridge investigations of the 1970s. Agent Wong had specialized training in analyzing historical criminal activities and their potential connections to current law enforcement concerns. Agent Wong's research revealed that the Cedar Ridge area had indeed been the site of significant federal law enforcement operations during the mid-1970s, involving multiple agencies and resulting in the disruption of criminal enterprises that had been using the remote mountain location for various illegal activities. The operations had been part of broader regional efforts to combat drug trafficking and weapons smuggling that had been taking advantage of isolated areas throughout the western mountains. The federal records revealed that the criminal operations in the Cedar Ridge area had been more extensive than what was suggested by the documents that Mrs. Mitchell had discovered. The activities had included the operation of clandestine drug laboratories, the storage and distribution of illegal weapons, and the use of remote mountain locations as staging areas for criminal activities that were conducted in other regions. The federal investigation had been initiated based on reports from local residents who had observed unusual activities in remote areas of the mountains, including increased vehicle traffic in areas where such activity was not normally expected, and the construction of structures in locations that were not accessible by normal roads or trails. The investigation had eventually led to the identification of a criminal organization that had been operating throughout the mountain region, using a network of remote properties and temporary facilities to support various illegal enterprises. The organization had been sophisticated in its operations, employing advanced communication systems and transportation methods that enabled them to operate in challenging mountain terrain while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. Agent Wong's research also revealed that the federal investigation had been successful in disrupting the criminal organization and had resulted in multiple arrests and prosecutions of individuals who had been involved in the illegal activities. However, some aspects of the criminal enterprise had not been fully investigated due to resource limitations and the challenging terrain that made comprehensive searches difficult to conduct. The historical investigation had also revealed that some members of the criminal organization had escaped arrest and might have continued their activities in other locations or might have returned to the Kago mountain region after law enforcement attention had diminished. This possibility suggested that the historical documents might have relevance to current law enforcement concerns about criminal activities in remote mountain areas. Deputy Santos worked with Agent Wong to analyze the specific locations and activities documented in Mrs. Mitchell's collection of materials, comparing them with current knowledge about the mountain region and looking for any indications that historical criminal sites might still be relevant to current law enforcement concerns. This analysis revealed that several of the locations mentioned in the historical documents were in areas that Deputy Santos had occasionally encountered evidence of recent human activity during her patrol duties. The activity had not appeared to be criminal in nature, but the historical context provided by the documents suggested that these areas might warrant more careful attention and investigation. The investigation expanded to include systematic examination of the remote mountain locations that had been identified in the historical documents, using modern investigative techniques and equipment that had not been available during the original federal operations of the 1970s. This examination was conducted as a joint operation involving local law enforcement, federal agencies, and specialized teams trained in mountain rescue and wilderness operations. Field investigation revealed that several of the historical criminal sites still contained evidence of the activities that had been conducted there decades earlier. Some sites showed signs of more recent use, suggesting that the locations might have been revisited by individuals who had knowledge of their historical significance or who had discovered them independently. One particularly significant discovery was made at a remote location where the historical documents had indicated that a major drug manufacturing operation had been conducted during the 1970s. The site showed evidence of recent construction and modification activities that suggested someone had been working to restore or expand the facilities that had been abandoned decades earlier. The evidence of recent activity at the historical criminal site prompted an expanded investigation that included surveillance operations and coordination with federal agencies that specialized in drug enforcement and organized crime investigations. The investigation revealed that the site was indeed being used for current criminal activities that were connected to regional drug trafficking operations. Current criminal activities at the site were being conducted by individuals who had apparently discovered the historical location and had recognized its potential advantages for illegal operations. The site's remote location, difficult access, and previous modifications for criminal use made it attractive for individuals who wanted to conduct illegal activities without detection by law enforcement agencies. The investigation of the current criminal activities led to arrests and prosecutions of several individuals who had been involved in drug trafficking operations that were using the remote mountain location as a base for their activities. The successful resolution of the case was attributed in part to the historical information that had been preserved in Mrs. Mitchell's collection of documents. The case had demonstrated the value of preserving historical information about criminal activities and the importance of maintaining institutional knowledge about law enforcement operations that had been conducted in previous decades. The historical documents had provided crucial insights that had enabled current investigators to understand the significance of activities they might otherwise have overlooked. Deputy Santos's work on the historical investigation had enhanced her understanding of the criminal history of her patrol area and had provided her with valuable knowledge about locations and activities that required ongoing attention from law enforcement agencies. The case had also strengthened relationships between local and federal law enforcement agencies and had improved coordination for addressing criminal activities in remote mountain areas. The investigation had also revealed the importance of community cooperation in law enforcement activities, as Mrs. Mitchell's decision to report her discovery of the historical documents had been crucial to the success of the entire operation. The case had demonstrated that residents of mountain communities could play important roles in supporting law enforcement efforts through their knowledge of local history and their observations of current activities. Sheriff Chun and Deputy Santos worked with federal agencies to develop improved procedures for sharing historical information and coordinating investigations that involved both past and current criminal activities. The procedures would help ensure that valuable historical information was preserved and made available to current investigators who might benefit from understanding the criminal history of their jurisdictions. Case had also highlighted the challenges and opportunities involved in law enforcement work in remote mountain areas, where historical criminal activities might have continuing relevance to current law enforcement concerns, and where the isolation that attracted criminals also made investigation and enforcement activities more difficult to conduct. Mrs. Mitchell's contribution to the investigation was recognized by law enforcement agencies and community organizations, and her willingness to share historical information was used as an example to encourage other longtime residents to report discoveries that might be relevant to law enforcement activities. The case had demonstrated that historical information could have significant value for current investigations and public safety efforts. The resolution of the case had provided closure for historical criminal activities that had affected the Cedar Ridge community decades earlier and had prevented current criminal operations from becoming established in the same remote mountain locations. The investigation had protected the community from potential criminal activities and had preserved the peaceful character of the mountain village that residents valued. Deputy Santos continued her patrol duties in the Cedar Ridge area with enhanced knowledge about the criminal history of the PA region and improved awareness of locations and activities that might require special attention from law enforcement agencies. Her experience with the historical investigation had provided her with valuable skills and knowledge that would benefit her future work in mountain law enforcement. The case had also contributed to the broader understanding of criminal activities in remote mountain areas and had provided law enforcement agencies with insights into the techniques and locations that criminals might use to take advantage of challenging terrain and isolation. The information would be valuable for training other officers who worked in similar mountain environments. As the investigation concluded and normal patrol activities resumed, the mountain village of Cedar Ridge returned to its quiet routine, but with the knowledge that its residents and law enforcement officers had successfully addressed both historical and current threats to community safety. The case had demonstrated the importance of vigilance and community cooperation in Kofeo, maintaining the security and peaceful character of mountain communities. The historical documents that had initiated the investigation were preserved in law enforcement archives where they would be available for future reference and research. The materials represented a valuable record of criminal history and law enforcement activities that had shaped the development of the Cedar Ridge community and the broader mountain region. Deputy Santos reflected on the case as an example of how historical knowledge and current law enforcement techniques could be combined to address complex criminal activities that spanned multiple decades and involved both past and present threats to community safety. The investigation had reinforced her commitment to serving the mountain communities that depended on law enforcement officers who understood both their history and their current needs. Officer Daniel Harrison had been assigned to patrol the areas along the Willow River for nearly 15 years, driving the winding roads that followed the waterway as it meandered through farmland, small communities, and patches of woodland that had remained largely unchanged for generations. His patrol route covered approximately 60 miles of river frontage, encompassing both sides of the waterway and including several small towns, numerous rural residences, and various commercial enterprises that had been drawn to riverside locations for practical or aesthetic reasons. The Willow River had always been more than just a geographical feature in the region. It was a source of recreation, commerce, and community identity that influenced the daily lives of residents in ways both obvious and subtle. People fished from its banks, launched boats from its public access points, and built homes where they could enjoy views of the flowing water and the wildlife that depended on the riparian environment for habitat. Over the years of his river patrol assignment, Officer Harrison had developed an intimate knowledge of the waterway and the people who lived and worked along its course. He knew the seasonal patterns of recreational use, the locations where problems typically occurred, and the individual residents whose properties bordered the river and who served as informal guardians of their particular sections of the waterway. The nature of river patrol work brought Officer Harrison into contact with a variety of incidents that reflected the complex relationship between human activities and the natural environment. He investigated reports of pollution, responded to boating accidents, mediated disputes between property owners and recreational users, and worked with environmental agencies to address various forms of illegal dumping and habitat destruction. However, beginning in the spring of what would prove to be a particularly challenging year, Officer Harrison began to encounter a series of incidents along the river that defied easy explanation and that would eventually require him to develop new investigative skills and coordinate with agencies that had not previously been involved in routine river patrol activities. First unusual incident occurred near the town of Millville, where the river made a sharp bend around a heavily wooded area that had been preserved as a small nature park. A group of kayakers had discovered what appeared to be the remains of a small structure that had been partially buried in the riverbank, exposed by spring flooding that had eroded the soil around it. The structure appeared to be constructed of concrete and metal, and its design suggested that it had been built for some specific purpose rather than being simply discarded construction materials. The kayakers had reported their discovery to local authorities because they were concerned that the structure might represent some form of environmental hazard or might be connected to illegal activities that had occurred in the area. Officer Harrison responded to the report and conducted his own examination of the discovered structure, documenting its location and characteristics while trying to determine its origin and purpose. The structure appeared to be quite old, suggesting that it had been in place for many years before being exposed by the recent flooding. The investigation of the mysterious structure required Officer Harrison to research historical records and consult with various experts who might be able to provide insights into its construction and purpose. This research revealed that the area where the structure was found had been the site of various industrial activities during earlier decades, including a small manufacturing plant that had operated during the 1950s and 1960s. The historical research led Officer Harrison to retired engineer Martin Rodriguez, who had worked at the manufacturing plant during its final years of operation and who retained detailed knowledge about the facility and its impact on the surrounding environment. Mr. Rodriguez was able to provide information that helped explain the mysterious structure and its connection to activities that had occurred decades earlier. Mr. Rodriguez explained that the manufacturing plant had used various chemical processes that had generated waste materials requiring special disposal procedures. The concrete and metal structure that had been discovered appeared to be the remains of a waste containment system that had been installed to prevent contamination of soil and groundwater in the area around the plant. The discovery of the old waste containment structure raised questions about potential environmental contamination that might have persisted in the area since the manufacturing plant had ceased operations. Officer Harrison coordinated with state environmental agencies to conduct testing of soil and water samples to determine if any hazardous materials remained that might pose risks to public health or environmental quality. The environmental testing revealed low levels of industrial contaminants that were consistent with the historical use of the site for manufacturing activities, but the contamination levels were not sufficient to pose immediate health risks or to require emergency remediation measures. However, the discovery prompted additional investigation to determine if other sites along the river might have been affected by similar industrial activities. The investigation of historical industrial sites along the Willow River revealed that several other locations had been used for manufacturing or waste disposal activities that might have left environmental legacies requiring attention from regulatory agencies. Officer Harrison worked with environmental specialists to develop a systematic survey of these sites and to prioritize them for further investigation and potential remediation. Second unusual incident occurred several weeks later near the town of Riverside, where a local fisherman discovered what appeared to be barrels or containers that had been dumped in the river and had become partially buried in sediment on the river bottom. The containers were visible only during periods of low water, which explained why they had not been noticed previously by other river users. The fisherman, Tom Wilson, contacted Officer Harrison because he was concerned that the containers might contain hazardous materials that could pose risks to water quality and aquatic life. Mr. Wilson had been fishing the Willow River for over 30 years and was familiar with the normal appearance of the river bottom in various locations. Officer Harrison arranged for the containers to be recovered from the river by divers from the State Environmental Agency, who had the specialized equipment and training necessary to safely handle potentially hazardous materials found in aquatic environments. The recovery operation required careful planning to minimize disturbance to river ecology while ensuring the safety of personnel involved in the operation. The recovered containers were found to contain industrial solvents and other chemicals that had been illegally dumped in the river at some time in the past. The chemicals were not in immediate danger of causing environmental damage due to the sealed nature of the containers, but their presence in the river violated various environmental protection laws and raised questions about other illegal dumping that might have occurred. The investigation of the dumped containers led to coordination with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over environmental crimes, including the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. The federal involvement brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation and enabled more comprehensive testing and analysis of the recovered materials. The federal investigation revealed that the dumped containers were linked to a regional disposal company that had been operating illegally for several years, collecting hazardous waste materials from various businesses and disposing of them in rivers, abandoned properties, and other unauthorized locations throughout the region. The illegal disposal operation had affected multiple watersheds and had involved the dumping of thousands of gallons of hazardous materials in locations where they could cause long-term environmental damage. The investigation eventually led to federal criminal charges against several individuals and companies that had been involved in the illegal disposal activities. Officer Harrison's role in identifying and reporting the dumped containers had been crucial to the success of the federal investigation and had led to the prevention of additional illegal dumping that could have caused significant environmental damage. His careful documentation of the discovery and his coordination with appropriate agencies had ensured that the incident was handled properly and that evidence was preserved for prosecution. Third unusual incident along Officer Harrison's river patrol occurred during the summer months when recreational use of the waterway was at its peak. A group of canoeists discovered what appeared to be the remains of an old bridge or structure that had been partially submerged in the river for many years but was becoming more visible due to drought conditions that had lowered water levels. The structure appeared to be quite substantial, suggesting that it had been an important transportation link at some point in the past. However, historical records of bridges and other river crossings in the area did not include any documentation of a structure at that particular location, leading to questions about its origin and the circumstances that had led to its abandonment. Officer Harrison's investigation of the mysterious bridge remains required extensive research into historical records and consultation with local historians who might have knowledge about transportation infrastructure that had existed in earlier periods. This research revealed that the structure was likely the remains of a railroad bridge that had been built during the early 1900s but had been abandoned when rail service to the area was discontinued. The historical research led to the discovery of additional information about the railroad line and its impact on local communities during its years of operation. The research revealed that the railroad had been involved in transporting various industrial products and raw materials, including some that might have had environmental implications for the river and surrounding areas. The investigation of the abandoned railroad bridge expanded to include examination of historical documents related to the railroad's operations and any incidents that might have occurred involving the transportation of hazardous materials. This research revealed that several accidents had occurred along the rail line, including at least one incident involving the derailment of cars carrying chemical products near the river. The historical accident reports led to additional environmental testing in areas where railroad accidents had occurred, revealing evidence of soil contamination that had persisted for decades since the accidents had taken place. The contamination was not severe enough to pose immediate health risks, but it required ongoing monitoring and potential remediation activities. Officer Harrison's investigation of the abandoned bridge had uncovered historical information that was valuable for understanding the environmental history of the river and for identifying areas that might require attention from environmental agencies. The research had also provided insights into the industrial and transportation history of the region that were of interest to local historians and preservation organizations. Investigation of these three unusual incidents along the Willow River had revealed the complex environmental history of the waterway and had led to improved coordination between law enforcement agencies and environmental organizations responsible for protecting water quality and aquatic habitats. Officer Harrison had developed expertise in environmental crime investigation that made him a valuable resource for other agencies dealing with similar issues. The cases had also highlighted the importance of maintaining vigilance about potential environmental hazards along waterways and had demonstrated the value of cooperation between law enforcement officers, regulatory agencies, and community members in identifying and addressing environmental problems. Officer Harrison's 15 years of river patrol experience had provided him with unique insights into the relationship between human activities and river environments, and his careful attention to unusual incidents had contributed to important discoveries about historical, environmental impacts and ongoing protection needs. The successful investigation of the river incidents had strengthened relationships between various agencies responsible for different aspects of environmental protection and law enforcement, creating improved procedures for addressing complex cases that required multi-agency coordination and specialized expertise. As Officer Harrison continued his river patrol duties, he remained alert for additional incidents that might require investigation and that might provide further insights into the environmental and criminal history of the Willow River watershed. His experience had demonstrated that careful observation and thorough investigation could reveal important information about past activities and their continuing consequences for environmental quality and public safety. The cases had also emphasized the importance of preserving historical records and maintaining institutional knowledge about past industrial and transportation activities that might have environmental implications, requiring ongoing attention from regulatory agencies and law enforcement organizations. Officer Harrison's work on the river cases had enhanced his reputation as a law enforcement officer with specialized expertise in environmental crime investigation, leading to requests for assistance from other agencies and opportunities to participate in training programs for officers, dealing with similar issues in other watersheds and environmental settings. The investigation of the Willow River incidents had provided valuable lessons about the complex challenges involved in protecting water resources and addressing the environmental legacies of past industrial activities. The cases had demonstrated the importance of coordination between law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and community organizations in maintaining the environmental quality and public safety of important natural resources. River patrol assignment had evolved from routine law enforcement duties into a specialized field that required knowledge of environmental science, historical research techniques, and coordination with multiple agencies that had different but complementary responsibilities for protecting water resources and public health. Officer Harrison's experience along the Willow River had become a model for other law enforcement agencies that were responsible for patrolling waterways and addressing environmental crimes. His techniques for identifying potential environmental hazards and coordinating with appropriate agencies had been incorporated into training programs for officers working in similar environments. Asterisk. The mountain village of Cedar Ridge sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by peaks that rose like ancient guardians against the sky, their slopes covered with dense forests of pine and fir that changed colors with the seasons and provided a backdrop of natural beauty that had drawn settlers to the area over a century earlier. The village had grown slowly over the generations, developing from a logging camp into a small but stable community that balanced respect for its mountain environment with the practical needs of residents who had chosen to make their lives in this remote and challenging location. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos had been serving Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountain communities for 12 years, covering a patrol area that encompassed hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain where scattered residences, small businesses, and seasonal cabins were connected by winding roads that followed the contours of the landscape. Her work required her to be part law enforcement officer, part social worker, and part mountain rescue specialist, as the isolation and self-reliance that characterized mountain life often meant that she was the first and sometimes only official responder to a wide variety of situations. The nature of law enforcement in a mountain village was different from police work in urban areas, involving longer response times, greater distances between incidents, and residents who often preferred to handle their problems independently rather than seeking help from outside authorities. Deputy Santos had learned to approach her work with patience and understanding, recognizing that successful policing in a mountain community required building trust and maintaining relationships that might be called upon in emergency situations. During the autumn of her 12th year of service in Cedar Ridge, Deputy Santos found herself investigating a series of incidents that would challenge her understanding of the community she had served for so long and would reveal historical connections between past events and current circumstances that had not been apparent during her years of routine patrol work. The investigation began when Eleanor Mitchell, an 84-year-old resident who had lived in Cedar Ridge for over 60 years, contacted Deputy Santos about some unusual discoveries she had made while cleaning out the attic of her family's mountain cabin. Mrs. Mitchell had been preparing to move to assisted living facility in the valley below and was sorting through decades of accumulated possessions when she found a collection of documents that seemed to relate to criminal activities that had occurred in the area during the 1970s. Mrs. Mitchell's family had owned property in Cedar Ridge since the 1920s, when her grandfather had purchased several hundred acres of mountainous land for use as a summer retreat and hunting preserve. Over the decades, the family had built cabins, cleared trails, and developed the property into a compound that had served multiple generations as a gathering place for vacations and family celebrations. Documents that Mrs. Mitchell had discovered were contained in a wooden box that had been stored in a corner of the attic beneath other family belongings. The box contained newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be official reports related to a series of crimes that had occurred in the Cedar Ridge area during the Vale. Mid-1970s. Deputy Santos responded to Mrs. Mitchell's call and examined the documents carefully, finding them to be a fascinating collection of materials that provided insights into criminal activities that had apparently been investigated by law enforcement agencies decades earlier. The documents suggested that Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountain areas had been the site of significant criminal operations that had not been widely known to local residents. The newspaper clippings included articles from regional newspapers that reported on federal investigations of illegal activities in remote mountain areas, including drug manufacturing operations, weapons trafficking, and other crimes that had taken advantage of the isolation and difficult access that characterized much of the mountain region. The handwritten notes appeared to have been made by someone who had been observing and documenting suspicious activities in the Cedar Ridge area over a period of several months. The notes included detailed descriptions of vehicles' license plate numbers and individuals who had been seen in locations where they might not have been expected to have legitimate business. The photographs in the collection showed various locations in the Cedar Ridge area, including some that Deputy Santos recognized as remote areas of the mountain where few people would normally have reason to visit. Some of the photographs appeared to show structures or modifications to natural features that suggested human activities that might have been related to the criminal operations described in the newspaper articles. The official reports in the collection appeared to be copies of law enforcement documents that detailed investigations of criminal activities in mountain areas, including specific references to the Cedar Ridge region and surrounding communities. The reports suggested that federal agencies had conducted extensive operations in the area during the 1970s that had resulted in arrests and prosecutions of individuals involved in various illegal enterprises. Deputy Santos recognized that the documents represented potentially significant historical information about criminal activities that had affected her patrol area, but she also understood that the materials might contain information that was relevant to current law enforcement concerns or that might provide insights into ongoing problems in the mountain region. She contacted her supervisor, Sheriff Robert Chun, to report the discovery and to discuss the appropriate way to handle the historical documents while ensuring that any current law enforcement implications were properly addressed. Sheriff Chun had served in mountain law enforcement for over 20 years and had institutional knowledge about historical criminal activities that might be relevant to interpreting the discovered materials. Sheriff Chun examined the documents and confirmed that they appeared to be authentic materials related to federal investigations that had occurred during the 1970s. He recalled that senior officers had occasionally mentioned historical criminal activities in the mountain region, but the specific details had not been widely documented or preserved in current departmental records. Investigation of the historical documents led Sheriff Chun and Deputy Santos to contact federal agencies that might have been involved in the original investigations and that might have institutional records that could provide additional context for understanding the materials that Mrs. Mitchell had discovered. FBI Special Agent Patricia Wong was assigned to coordinate federal response to the inquiry about the historical documents, bringing with her access to archived federal case files and databases that might contain information related to the Cedar Ridge investigations of the 1970s. Agent Wong had specialized training in analyzing historical criminal activities and their potential connections to current law enforcement concerns. Agent Wong's research revealed that the Cedar Ridge area had indeed been the site of significant federal law enforcement operations during the mid-1970s. involving multiple agencies and resulting in the disruption of criminal enterprises that had been using the remote mountain location for various illegal activities. The operations had been part of broader regional efforts to combat drug trafficking and weapons smuggling that had been taking advantage of isolated areas throughout the western mountains. The federal records revealed that the criminal operations in the Cedar Ridge area had been more extensive than what was suggested by the documents that Mrs. Mitchell had discovered. The activities had included the operation of clandestine drug laboratories, the storage and distribution of illegal weapons, and the use of remote mountain locations as staging areas for criminal activities that were conducted in other regions. The federal investigation had been initiated based on reports from local residents who had observed unusual activities in remote areas of the mountains, including increased vehicle traffic in areas where such activity was not normally expected, and the construction of structures in locations that were not accessible by normal roads or trails. The investigation had eventually led to the identification of a criminal organization that had been operating throughout the mountain region, using a network of remote properties and temporary facilities to support various illegal enterprises. The organization had been sophisticated in its operations, employing advanced communication systems and transportation methods that enabled them to operate in challenging mountain terrain while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. The investigation of the current criminal activities led to arrests and prosecutions of several individuals who had been involved in drug trafficking operations that were using the remote mountain location as a base for their activities. The successful resolution of the case was attributed in part to the historical information that had been preserved in Mrs. Mitchell's collection of documents. The case had demonstrated the value of preserving historical information about criminal activities and the importance of maintaining institutional knowledge about law enforcement operations that had been conducted in previous decades. The historical documents had provided crucial insights that had enabled current investigators to understand the significance of activities they might otherwise have overlooked. Deputy Santos's work on the historical investigation had enhanced her understanding of the criminal history of her patrol area and had provided her with valuable knowledge about locations and activities that required ongoing attention from law enforcement agencies. The case had also strengthened relationships between local and federal law enforcement agencies and had improved coordination for addressing criminal activities in remote mountain areas. The investigation had also revealed the importance of community cooperation in law enforcement activities, as Mrs. Mitchell's decision to report her discovery of the historical documents had been crucial to the success of the entire operation. The case had demonstrated that residents of mountain communities could play important roles in supporting law enforcement efforts through their knowledge of local history and their observations of current activities. Sheriff Chun and Deputy Santos worked with federal agencies to develop improved procedures for sharing historical information and coordinating investigations that involved both past and current criminal activities. The procedures would help ensure that valuable historical information was preserved and made available to current investigators who might benefit from understanding the criminal history of their jurisdictions. The case had also highlighted the challenges and opportunities involved in law enforcement work in remote mountain areas, where historical criminal activities might have continuing relevance to current law enforcement concerns, and where the isolation that attracted criminals also made investigation and enforcement activities more difficult to conduct. Mrs. Mitchell's contribution to the investigation was recognized by law enforcement agencies and community organizations, and her willingness to share historical information was used as an example to encourage other longtime residents to report discoveries that might be relevant to law enforcement activities. The case had demonstrated that historical information could have significant value for current investigations and public safety efforts. The resolution of the case had provided closure for historical criminal activities that had affected the Cedar Ridge community decades earlier and had prevented current criminal operations from becoming established in the same remote mountain locations. The investigation had protected the community from potential criminal activities and had preserved the peaceful character of the mountain village that residents valued. Deputy Santos continued her patrol duties in the Cedar Ridge area with enhanced knowledge about the criminal history of the region and improved awareness of locations and activities that might require special attention from law enforcement agencies. Her experience with the historical investigation had provided her with valuable skills and knowledge that would benefit her future work in mountain law enforcement. Asterisk. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Coleman had spent 22 years serving the communities that comprised the northern district of her county, a region that encompassed small towns, rural areas, and the kind of quiet neighborhoods where people knew their neighbors and where serious crime had always been relatively rare. As she approached retirement, she found herself reflecting on the cases that had defined her career and the changes she had witnessed in both the nature of criminal activity and the techniques used to investigate and solve complex cases. The final months of Detective Coleman's active service brought with them a collection of cases that seemed to encapsulate many of the themes and challenges that had characterized her long career in law enforcement. These cases involved elements of community cooperation, patient investigation, the application of both traditional and modern investigative techniques, and the satisfaction that came from bringing resolution to situations that had troubled residents and disrupted the peaceful routines of small-town life. On a warm morning in early June, Detective Coleman received a call from the police department in Millbrook, the same quiet town where Officer Margaret Chun had investigated Sarah Mitchell's mysterious disappearance several years earlier. Call came from Officer David Park, who had been promoted to detective and was now handling criminal investigations for the small department that served Millbrook and several surrounding communities. Detective Park reported that construction workers renovating an old building in downtown Millbrook had made an unusual discovery while demolishing a wall in the basement of the structure. Behind the wall, they had found a collection of items that appeared to be stolen property from burglaries that had occurred in the area many years earlier. The discovery had raised questions about the building's history and the circumstances that had led to the concealment of what appeared to be evidence from unsolved crimes. The building where the discovery had been made was the former Henderson's hardware store, a business that had served the Millbrook community for decades before closing when its elderly owner had retired and moved to a nursing home in a neighboring city. The building had been purchased by developers who planned to convert it into apartments for young professionals who were beginning to move to Millbrook as housing costs in larger cities made small-town living more attractive. Detective Coleman drove to Millbrook to assist with the investigation, bringing with her experience in analyzing evidence from cold cases and coordinating with other law enforcement agencies that might have records related to historical criminal activities. Her arrival in Millbrook brought back memories of the Sarah Mitchell case and the community's response to that unsolved mystery, which had left a lasting impact on residents who still wondered about what had happened to their missing neighbor. The construction workers who had made the discovery, led by foreman Tom Wilson, explained that they had been removing a wall in the basement to create additional space for utilities when they had found that the wall was actually a false partition that concealed a hidden room. The room contained shelves and storage areas that held a variety of items including jewelry, electronics, tools, and other objects that appeared to be valuable merchandise that someone had carefully organized and preserved. Detective Park had already begun the process of documenting the discovered items and had started researching police records to determine if any of the merchandise matched descriptions of property that had been reported stolen in past burglary cases. His preliminary investigation had revealed that some of the items appeared to correspond to thefts that had been reported during the 1990s, suggesting that the hidden room had been used to store stolen property for many years. Detective Coleman examined the hidden room and its contents, noting the careful organization of the stored items and the sophisticated construction of the concealed space. The room had been built with obvious attention to preventing detection, including soundproofing materials and ventilation systems that would have made it virtually impossible to discover without the demolition work that had exposed it. The investigation of the hidden room's contents required extensive research into historical police records and coordination with law enforcement agencies throughout the region that might have investigated burglaries during the time period when the stolen property appeared to have been accumulated. This research revealed that the concealed room contained evidence from dozens of unsolved burglary cases that had puzzled investigators for years. The research also revealed connections between the discovered stolen property and several individuals who had been suspected of involvement in burglary activities during the 1990s, but who had never been prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. The discovery of the hidden room provided new evidence that enabled investigators to reopen cold cases and pursue prosecutions that had not been possible when the original crimes had been committed. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation was its connection to the former owner of Henderson's hardware store, Robert Henderson, who had died 3 years earlier without ever being suspected of involvement in criminal activities. Mr. Henderson had been a respected member of the Millbrook community who had operated his hardware store successfully for over 40 years and had been known for his helpful service to customers and his contributions to community organizations. The investigation revealed that Mr. Henderson had apparently been involved in receiving and storing stolen property for an organized burglary ring that had operated throughout the region during the 1990s. His hardware store had provided an ideal cover for the operation, as the business legitimately dealt in tools, equipment, and other items that were commonly targeted by burglars. The discovery of Mr. Henderson's involvement in criminal activities came as a shock to Millbrook residents who had known him as a trustworthy businessman and community leader. The revelation demonstrated how sophisticated criminal operations could be conducted in small communities by individuals who maintained respectable public personas while secretly participating in illegal enterprises. Detective Coleman worked with Detective Park to develop a comprehensive understanding of the burglary ring's operations and to identify other individuals who might have been involved in the criminal activities. This investigation required coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and consultation with federal investigators who had expertise in analyzing organized criminal enterprises. The investigation expanded when additional evidence was discovered that connected the Millbrook burglary ring to similar operations in other small towns throughout the region. The evidence suggested that the criminal organization had been using a network of seemingly legitimate businesses to receive, store, and distribute stolen property across a wide geographic area. The investigation of the burglary ring's operations led to the reopening of dozens of cold cases and provided closure for many victims who had never recovered their stolen property or seen justice for the crimes committed against them. The discovery of the hidden room in Henderson's hardware store had provided the breakthrough that investigators had needed to understand and prosecute a criminal enterprise that had operated successfully for many years. As the Millbrook investigation continued, Detective Coleman was called to assist with another case in the coastal town of Seabrook, where Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos was investigating a series of incidents that appeared to be connected to some of the abandoned property cases that had puzzled law enforcement agencies several years earlier. The new Seabrook case involved the discovery of a sophisticated storage and distribution facility that had been established in an abandoned warehouse complex near the harbor. The facility contained valuable merchandise that appeared to have been stolen from various sources and was being prepared for shipment to buyers in other regions. Detective Santos had discovered the facility during a routine patrol when she had noticed increased activity at the supposedly abandoned warehouse complex and had investigated to determine the source of the activity. Her investigation had revealed that the facility was being used by a criminal organization that had been operating along the coast for several years, using abandoned properties and maritime transportation to support their illegal enterprises. The investigation of the Seabrook warehouse facility required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and the application of surveillance techniques that could monitor the complex criminal operations being conducted at the site. Detective Coleman's experience with organized criminal enterprises made her a valuable contributor to the investigation. The surveillance operations revealed that the Seabrook facility was part of a larger criminal network that extended along the entire coastal region and included connections to the mountain communities where Deputy Maria Santos had investigated historical criminal activities. The various cases that had seemed unrelated were actually components of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for many years. The investigation of the coastal criminal network led to coordinated law enforcement operations that disrupted illegal activities in multiple communities and resulted in the arrest and prosecution of dozens of individuals who had been involved in various forms of organized crime. The operations demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation and information sharing in addressing criminal enterprises that operated across jurisdictional boundaries. Detective Coleman's final major case involved returning to the rural community where Officer Daniel Harrison had been conducting river patrol activities. Environmental investigators had discovered additional evidence of illegal dumping activities that appeared to be connected to the historical criminal operations that had been disrupted years earlier. The new environmental investigation revealed that the illegal disposal activities had been more extensive than originally understood and had involved the systematic contamination of multiple river systems throughout the region. The investigation required coordination between law enforcement agencies and environmental specialists who could assess the long-term impact of the illegal activities and develop remediation strategies. That the environmental case provided Detective Coleman with an opportunity to apply her investigative experience to a different type of criminal activity that required understanding of scientific principles and regulatory requirements as well as traditional law enforcement techniques. The case demonstrated the evolving nature of criminal investigation and the need for law enforcement officers to develop expertise in specialized areas. As Detective Coleman prepared for retirement, she reflected on the cases that had defined her career and the changes she had witnessed in both criminal activities and investigative techniques. The cases had demonstrated the importance of patient investigation, community cooperation, and interagency coordination in addressing complex criminal enterprises that affected multiple communities. Resolution of her final cases had provided satisfying conclusions to investigations that had spanned many years and had involved the cooperation of numerous law enforcement agencies and community organizations. The cases had also demonstrated the continuing relevance of careful police work and the value of maintaining institutional knowledge about criminal activities and investigative techniques. Detective Coleman's retirement celebration was attended by colleagues from throughout the region who had worked with her on various cases and who had benefited from her experience and expertise. The celebration provided an opportunity to recognize her contributions to law enforcement and to acknowledge the positive impact that her work had had on the community she had served. The final investigations had revealed the interconnected nature of criminal activities across the region, showing how cases that had initially appeared to be separate incidents were actually part of larger criminal enterprises that had operated for years across multiple jurisdictions. The resolution of these cases had brought closure to dozens of unsolved crimes and had provided justice for countless victims who had waited years to see their cases resolved. As Detective Coleman transitioned to retirement, she made herself available as a consultant for complex cases that might benefit from her experience and institutional knowledge. Her expertise in investigating organized criminal enterprises and coordinating multi-agency operations made her a valuable resource for law enforcement agencies that faced challenging cases requiring specialized knowledge and techniques. The cases that had defined Detective Coleman's final months of active service had provided appropriate conclusions to a career dedicated to protecting communities from criminal activities and ensuring that justice was achieved for victims of crime. The cases had demonstrated the cumulative impact of careful police work and the importance of maintaining vigilance about criminal activities that could threaten community safety and well-being. The quiet conclusion of these final investigations reflected the nature of law enforcement work in small communities, where success was often measured not by dramatic arrests or high-profile prosecutions, but by the restoration of peace and security to neighborhoods where people could live their lives without fear of criminal victimization. Detective Coleman's retirement marked the end of a career that had spanned significant changes in law enforcement techniques and had encompassed investigations of criminal activities ranging from simple theft, sophisticated organized crime enterprises. Her experience provided valuable lessons for the officers who would continue her work, and her legacy would contribute to the ongoing efforts to maintain safety and security in the community she had served with distinction. The final cases had brought together themes and characters from earlier investigations, demonstrating the interconnected nature of criminal activities and the importance of maintaining comprehensive records and institutional knowledge about past cases that might provide insights for future investigations. The resolution of these cases provided closure not only for immediate criminal activities, but also for historical questions that had puzzled investigators and community members for many years. As Detective Coleman's active career came to a peaceful close, the communities she had served could reflect on the positive impact of dedicated law enforcement professionals who had worked tirelessly to protect their safety and to maintain the quality of life that made small-town living attractive to residents who valued security, community cooperation, and the peaceful rhythms of daily life in safe and well-protected neighborhoods. The legacy of her 22 years of service would continue to benefit the community she had protected through the improved investigative techniques she had helped develop, the relationship she had built between law enforcement agencies, and the mentorship she had provided to younger officers who would carry forward her commitment to thorough, patient, and professional police work. The final investigations had demonstrated that even at the end of a long and distinguished career, there were still mysteries to be solved, criminals to be apprehended, and communities to be protected. The work of law enforcement was never truly finished, but Detective Coleman could retire with the satisfaction of knowing that she had made a significant difference in the lives of the people she had served and in the safety of the communities that had been her responsibility.